Hi, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lee. I lead the Vivli effort as our CEO. I'm delighted to see everyone today. And for those of you at dinner, it was wonderful to have you here at dinner and to see everyone, some new faces and some old friends. It's my great honor to have Dr. Steffen Thirstrup with us today. He is the Chief Medical Officer at the European Medicines Agency and a visionary leader whose commitment to advancing healthcare innovation has been instrumental in shaping the future of medicines across Europe. Today, Dr. Thirstrup will be discussing the European health data space with us. It's a really groundbreaking initiative poised to revolutionize the way health data is managed, accessed, and utilized. Steffen is an MD and board certified in clinical pharmacology and therapeutics. He holds a PhD in pharmacology and has a background in clinical internal medicine with an emphasis on adult respiratory medicine. He has a distinguished career in the regulatory agencies and was at the Danish Medicines Agency first before coming to the European Medicines Agency. He's uniquely qualified to discuss the EHDS, and we look forward to hearing from him today. So, of course, EMA has been a key player in this area. So we'll have a short time for questions after his talk. So thank you so much for being with us today. Dr. Thirstrup.
Many thanks, Rebecca, and many thanks to Vivli for having me here today to give a presentation of the European health data space. And I hope, can I see my presentation here on the screen as well? That would be helpful. So European health data space, or EHDS, is the topic of my presentation. I think I want to start somewhere else, just to make sure that we are on the same page here. Europe is not the United States of Europe, for good and for bad. We are a political union of 27 member states who have agreed to collaborate, again, with all those challenges, and I think I'll come back to some of the challenges linked to the implementation, that at least what I see for the European health data space in doing this across a political union of 27 member states. So we are united in diversity. That's the motto, and diversity sometimes becomes a little bit too much for having to be united. So that's sometimes the challenge. Another note just to kick off today is, of course, also maybe to clarify the difference between the European Medicines Agency and the US FDA. Fundamentally, we only do drugs. We don't do cosmetics, tobacco, food. We do a little bit in medical devices, but that's only when it comes to drug-device combinations and companion diagnostics. The rest of the devices, also the high-class devices, they are dealt with by notified bodies. We sometimes, or we actually manage some of the expert panels related to the high level of devices. So just to give you a flavor of where I'm coming from as opposed to the US setting. And then, of course, the challenges of being part of a union of political. So this is the political vision of the European health data space. And I once heard a European commissioner, not the president, but the vice president of the European Commission, talking about the European health data space as roaming for healthcare. Because in Europe, we managed to deal with the roaming for mobile phone data, so you can move across without being completely, get your pockets emptied by paying for data. It's still expensive, but there is some level of roaming. And the idea is, first and foremost, the first idea about the European health data space on the left side of this picture, namely creating the opportunity for all citizens in Europe to access their own healthcare data and bring them across the border. So if I, as a Dane living in the Netherlands, go on vacation in Spain and fall sick, then I can show the Spanish doctor my health records from Denmark and the Netherlands and what he adds and so forth. You can imagine. So that is the concept, and that's created what is called My Health at EU. So that's the population, the patient-facing part of it. And the idea is, of course, to empower patients more to get access to healthcare, but also enable the healthcare professionals to deal better with patients coming across the border. But there is, of course, a secondary use of these data, because if you suddenly manage to gather healthcare information, and I'll come back to what kind of healthcare information we are planning to collect in Europe for the health data space. If you collect them in Europe, we are roughly 500 million people. You will get a huge database. So that opens the opportunity for do a lot of secondary use and data analytics into this. And that's where the interest of the European Medicines Agency and other bodies, of course, come in. What can we use these data for? And I'll give you a flavor, because we're already running some projects that are pathfinders pathfinders for the European health data space. And this is, of course, also the political vision that you, by having access to the entire union's health data, you can maybe help shape political positions, you can help shape policy interventions for diseases and so forth. So this is the vision. But these visions don't come without challenges from a regulatory and legal perspective. So there are a lot of other legislation and legislative acts that is intervened into the European health data space. I'm pretty sure you're all aware of our very complicated general data protection regulation, which is not the easiest thing in the world, but it's there. And of course, now we suddenly talk about every citizen's data being put into a platform, and how do we keep privacy in accordance with this regulation. On the other hand, there is a cross-border health directive which allow and give every citizen in Europe to seek healthcare outside their place of living, as long as within the union. So you have the opportunity as a citizen to move across borders, and therefore it would facilitate that cross-border movement if you can move your data with you, and it will help both you as a patient, but it will also help the treating physician in that one. Then there's, of course, a lot of things linked to the data governance, cybersecurity, and finally also a proposal to create a European digital identity. Many, but not all, European countries have a digital identity or a personal identifier. Denmark, where I come from, I'm born with a number that stays with me. Most likely it stays with me after my death, because you can still track the data that was linked to this identifier. And whatever I do in the Danish healthcare system is linked to my personal identifier number. So when I go to the doctor, when I go to the dentist, when I go to a pharmacy, when I'm submitted to hospital, if I deliver blood samples, if I get a pathology answer, if I have a cancer, and finally when I die, what was the cause of death. So creating that across Europe will of course also enable the way you can track data, but also maybe you will feel George Orwell's coming here that you can track. But anyway, we all have an iPhone in our pocket and no problem sharing our location and health data with Apple and Google and so forth. Or have we? I don't know. That's a personal statement. So on the left-hand side, we have the further vision of the European Commission, because they picked health as the first area where they want to have a data space. And so they have plans to create data spaces for energy, industry, finance, skills, climate, agriculture, public administration, and mobility. And they picked health as the first one. Interesting. So let's see, we are the test tube, let's put it that way. We are the monkeys, or the guinea pigs, for how we can do this in Europe, to create a pan-European data space for subject that has both an interest for the general public, or for a sub-part of the general public, but also have some big interest for policymakers. So this is, and I don't expect you to read all the details, and I'm pretty sure if you like, Rebecca can share the slides with you afterwards. I put in some hyperlinks in some of them as well. But of course, what we are planning to share, if we start at the upper left, electronic health record data, that's obvious, but also data on the doctors or healthcare professionals that are treating you, their specialization, where it happens, registers and data from medical products, but also medical devices, things that are automatically generated from wearables and so forth, but also socioeconomic factors and things that could have and determine on health, where you live, your education, and so forth. Whatever we can find here. And I think for you, for Vivli, I think these two, and the colors may not come through so clearly, but I read it out. So data from research cohorts, questionnaires, surveys related to health, and also data from clinical trials and clinical studies, and also studies and utilization. And here we have some of the European, we are good at acronyms. So CTIs, the clinical trial register, the SOHOs are substance of human origin. So that's semen, milk, tissue, blood, name it. MDR is medical device regulation, IVDR, in vitro diagnostic regulation. So I think these are where Vivli can, you maybe relate to what we are going to collect here, but we are going to collect much, much more. But it also means that you as a study subject, as a potential patient who volunteer for a clinical trial, you will actually also be able to see your data from that clinical trial in your My Data part of it, and it will be part of the entire health database that authorities and policy can use for policy making. So just to give you an example of how complicated this is going to work, imagine, and here we're only talking about the secondary use. I won't dwell more with the primary use of these data. So the secondary use, the EMA wants to explore something in a data set in the future European health data space. And on the top you have the data holder. The data holder will be the body that holds your data. That may be the electronic health records in member states and individual member states, so it may be pathology data and so forth. But we have to create, or there will be created, a health data access board. So that's the intermediary that will deal with the data. So the data, I think the mantra is data stays local. So we don't have to transfer the data. And again, to protect privacy, data will be in the individual countries close to the patients. But you can then do research local, and you can transfer the results. So if EMA is going to request, there will be a set of data catalogs where we will catalog of different kinds of data. EMA will have to, first of all, consult these catalogs to identify the right set of data that we want to do our investigation in, and we will ask for permission. So we review the data. It will be reviewed not by us, but it will be reviewed by the Health Data Access Board. Hopefully we will be granted access. I put a watch on here because this will take time. And then if allowed and approved, there will be a request from the data holder. So the data will be collected in the different data sets and metadata in the national authority, national databases, not only in one country, it could be across the entire union. The data will then be transferred into a secure environment where we can do our data processing, but we can only do the analysis, and we can do the analysis in this secure environment, and we can only retrieve the results in an anonymized version. So again, protecting privacy here. You may be able to see things in this room in a protected environment, but you cannot take the data on an individual level out and use. So we can then do we will have the analysis outcome, and we will then, because this is in the interest of the public, we will be obliged to publish the results of any of these minings within, is it 18 months, so within 1.5 years. So nothing is going to, I think that's the intention. Whoever wants to data mine in the public's, in the citizens' data, is also obliged to share the results publicly. So nothing hidden here, nothing secret going on. If someone is mining, the results will have to be for the greater good for those who actually provided the data. But this will, there is a euro sign here, it will cost money and it will take time. So of course the question is, and that I think is for the future to show, how agile will this system be? What kind of quick regulatory decisions will we actually be able to take using these data? We could imagine, and I'm thinking about when we rolled out the COVID-19 vaccines, so how quickly could we pick up on unknown side effects that had a deterrent? We did that for the J&J vaccine in the Nordics. We did that in 7 weeks. I'm not sure this system will be able to do it in 7 weeks. I don't know. I hope. I sincerely hope. But you could fear that it could be a complicated system to do for good reasons, because we're dealing with privacy and so forth. So maybe there will be a need for the opportunity to do quick searches when we talk about safety of new products, especially products that we rolled out in types of vaccines for pandemic. That's a good example, where we suddenly treat, if not the entire population, then at least large parts of the population. So this is at least the intention how this is going to work. When I saw this slide, because it's not a slide I created, some of my colleagues created it, I thought, yeah, okay, this is nice from a data privacy perspective, but it's also a complicated system that have a little bit of flavor of bureaucracy and yeah. Let's see. So at least that's the intention as it needs now. So there are a lot of Pathfinder initiatives that are going on and has been going on. And this list, and please note, this list is far from comprehensive. I picked those that I, at least myself, were aware of and have been talking to people working there. The first one is, of course, very important that it's driven by the European Commission. You know, how do we develop and deploy the IT infrastructure? Because it's no secret that you may see Europe as a digitized society. Well, that holds for some part of Europe. But there are also parts of Europe where getting Wi-Fi access or 3G, I didn't say 5 or 4G, I said 3G, is a challenge. Germany has a big, so we're not talking about minor countries. Some big countries have real big issues, still using paper files in their hospital system, so digitization is still on its advance in large parts of Europe. So we will have to have that infrastructure in place before we can go to the next step of having a unified healthcare data space here. So there are currently 17 partners, and they are running use cases to find out how can we roll this out. Then there is the TAHIDAS, or TUAT, European Health Data Space, 2 different, and I put here 13 with an exclamation mark because 30 countries is more than 27 European EU Union, so that goes a little bit beyond. But they have been doing a lot of interesting studies and also creating guidelines and technical specification. There is a study called Facilitate that looks on and that's more academic and small, medium-sized enterprises and patients. So patient access to clinical trial data and reuse of such data. I think that could be of interest for Vivli to dig into to facilitate. And that's why I put, and that's European Union or European Commission sponsored study. And then I put Darwin here, and I will show you Darwin because that's a network that the European Medicines Agency have set up to use this as a pathfinder. Both as a pathfinder for the European health data space, but in particular for the secondary use of healthcare data in our own decision-making process. And Darwin stands for, and I will see if I can get it right, it's the Data Analytics and Real-World Evidence Interrogation Network of EU. I have a colleague who is fantastic at coming up with acronyms. He could have a brilliant career in pharma, creating all the names you know for the clinical trials. But he came up with Darwin. So this is the Data Analytics Real-World Evidence Interrogation Network of the European Union. So currently, and this is increasing, we have added on data sources over the years, and we are currently having 25 data sources from 13 different European countries, and we cover 140 million citizens of Europe. Of course, not all the data for all 140 million, but the 140 individual patients, some of them give genomic data, some of them give prescription data, some of them give, so we don't have an entire data for all entire data set for all 140. The idea about the way Darwin is built is actually the way the health data space will be built as well. It will be the data. So if you take the yellow box is the Darwin Coordination Center. We are financing it, but it's located in the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. So they do this. They are scientists who can do data. They are data scientists. And the data partners, they are located in the different member states, so the different databases. I'll show you that, some examples of the databases in the next slide. And then the different countries have data permit authorities. Some of the data the coordination center have direct access to, but the rest of them will have to go via a data permit center. A little bit like the middle bar that I showed you in this complicated data access slide. So when you request data from the coordination center, it goes to the permit authority. The permit authority gets access to the data, do the analysis, runs the algorithm that the coordination center have created to solve the research question, and we get the aggregated results back, and we can accumulate that for all data centers. And if an EMA is the questioner, of course, we will get the aggregated results back. And our thinking is how can we, and where we are and what we're using Darwin for is how can we use these kind of data for our internal decision-making process. And all these four-letter acronyms, these are some of our scientific committees, the Committee for Human Medicines, the Safety Committee, the Orphan Committee, and the Scientific Advice Working Party. And we agreed on a common data model because that's also fundamental. If we don't have the common data model, we cannot exchange these data. So that's a mini version of the European health data space, and I'll give you some examples later on, where not concrete examples, but high-level examples. Here are some of the databases that we are currently on board, and you can look. Some of them are primary care health database. We have a big IQVIA database in Belgium. We have the UK CPRD Gold database. We have a hospital database in France. We have genomic data from Estonia, a biobank there. We have the Norwegian linked health registers. We are onboarding the Danish one. We have IQVIA from Germany. So you can see a lot of different data sources. And again, the plan is to add roughly 10 new data partners every year for the next couple of years. And here are some examples, and not concrete examples on studies we have done. I just wanted to show you some of our thinking here. Where can we use these kind of data? Where are we already trialing out with our scientific committees to use data from the Darwin? So disease epidemiology, really relevant for our orphan committee. You know, is this actually an orphan disease? How frequent is this disease in Europe as compared to globally and other places? What is the current standard of care and management of a certain disease? That often come up in regulatory decision. Is the study that has been conducted by industry, is this comparing the new product to the standard of care? And what is standard of care in Europe as compared to standard of care where the trial was run, maybe? So we can look into what is clinician management. Drug utilization studies, also to support pharmacovigilance. Discussion around the design and feasibility of studies. Is it actually possible to recruit patients with a certain disease or a certain level of disease? Can we find patients who have been treated with 3 lines of whatever chemotherapy, and how many do we find of them, and how long do they live? Representativeness of clinical trials as compared to how representative are the clinical study population to the European population. Increasingly interesting problem, because we see more and more studies being conducted outside Europe and outside US. I didn't say China, but we see studies coming from other populations that are different to the European and the US population. Of course, effectiveness studies and safety studies. Effectiveness studies is also relevant for the payers, and they are downstream to us, of course. And then impact of regulatory action. So if we restrict an indication or broaden out an indication or put in a warning, is this actually being taken up by the healthcare systems? And so do we do the right things, kind of quality assurance on regulatory decision? This is just a few examples, and we have trialed out some of them. I just wanted to then park the European health data space for 2 or 3 slides and talk about access to clinical trial data in Europe as it looks now, so disregarding what the European health data space will show in the future, because we are transitioning the clinical trial regulation. We are transitioning into the new clinical trial regulation in Europe. The clinical trial regulation was adopted in January 2022, and with that came a centralized system for the coordination of approval of clinical trials in Europe, and that's both for clinical trials run by commercial sponsors and clinical trials run by academia, so every clinical trial, independing on who is the sponsor. And that system is called CTIS, the Clinical Trials Information System, and I'm pretty sure you have heard about all the bugs and the challenges of running stuff in CTIS, and I should be the first to admit that system it had inborn errors, if not inborn errors of metabolism, which have now been corrected, most of them. There's still a few bugs, but we are working on it's up and running now, and it has to be up and running because as end of January 25, all clinical trials that are still ongoing but has been authorized according to the old legislation will have to be transferred into CTIS. So fundamentally, from January 2025, every clinical trial in Europe is to be found in CTIS. And the idea about CTIS is, as opposed to in the old days where you as an applicant had to go to the countries where you wanted to run the trial, and then they had to coordinate the assessment of the application and so forth. Now there is a single point of contact where you can submit, and then the authorities, I think we can start here before I go into explanation. There will be a public website, and I think that's the interesting one when it comes to access to data, because there you, as a citizen or whoever you are in Europe, also outside Europe, can see all ongoing clinical trials, all finalized clinical trials, and you will be able to see get access to the results of those clinical trials. Not raw data, but on an aggregated level, like in a publication. So the end of trial notification will trigger a request to the sponsor to submit the data within a certain time frame. So there will be access to all clinical trials in Europe here, which is a big step forward. We will have to see how compliant sponsors will be, but then I think I think there's not so much carrot, but maybe some sticks we can come up with to make this work. So the CTIS has a secured area. There's a workspace for the sponsors and whoever supports the sponsors. So if you as a pharma company have a CRO running it, the CRO can get access here. And then there's a workspace for the authorities. That means that's where the coordinated assessment of the application is taking place. And this is running fairly good because EMA and the member states have created a clinical trials facilitation group that's now called a coordination group, and they are doing a great work to make that coordination work. And regulatory authorities are, in Europe, used to work together. EMA has their 30 years anniversary next year, so we have 30 years experience in collaborating. When it comes to ethics committees, they have no or very limited experience in working together. They are not EU coordinated, and that is creating a lot of challenges because the timelines for assessment is, of course, not too long, let me put it that way. It's the interest of moving clinical trials forward. So the authorities can keep the timelines, but the ethics committees are understaffed and uncoordinated, and that creates a problem, and it's difficult to solve. And everybody who says, couldn't we have a pan-European ethics committee, will be, if not executed, but then pointed at. It's currently a no-go to discuss. And again, coming back to my first slide, Europe is united in diversity. And although you should think ethics is more or less a harmonized thing, again, in Europe, with different backgrounds, there are a lot of things that are viewed upon differently. If we take some of the most contentious one is, of course, What about pregnancy protection? Is that allowed in all Catholic countries? Maybe not, so maybe it's not going to be mandatory. So you can see there can be these differences in assessing the ethics. So that's at least cities and access to clinical trials. And this is how it looks at the moment, and it's a little bit busy slide. We have divided the type of data that you can get out trials into different categories. One is therapeutic use trials, so fundamentally what was called phase 4 trials in the old days. All data will be published by the end of the decision for the trial. Category 2, I think, is the best one because these are the phase 2 and phase 3 trials, and there will be a 30 months delay after end of trial until they get published, or should be published in the trial system. So these are the current plans, and we are also working, and I didn't put a slide in here, but EMA is also. We had a break to publish clinical trials under COVID-19 because we had other things to do. Let me put it that way. But we are now starting again publishing all the clinical data that have been submitted to us as part of an application for marketing authorization. And I say all clinical trials, so it's not only the phase 3 trials and not only the trials that has been published in New England Journal of Medicine or whatever they get published in, but also the phase 2 trials and the phase 1 trials that sometimes never get published in a peer-reviewed journal because who cares about a bioequivalent study, you know? But they will be there, yeah. So that was an intermezzo talking about clinical data in Europe disregarding European health data space. So what's next? So see, this is the timeline. It all started in May 2022 with the European Commission proposing this. And we are now at the end of the trialogue. And what is a trialogue? In Europe, the decision-making the European Commission proposes legislation. The European Parliament, so these are elected members of the European Parliament elected by the citizens of Europe, so coming from all member states, they have the first negotiation. But in the end, it's what is called the European Council, and that's the Council of the Ministers. So this would be the health ministers who decide. That's the trilogue, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council that finally agree on a law or legislation put into place. And that's just ended. That means, yes, we will have the European health data space. So the final text is now being, I don't think it's been published yet in the official OGA, that's not O.J. Simpson, but it's the official journal of the Union. And as soon as that gets published, that's day 0. So that's when the clock starts with if the legislation says anything about implementation phase and when something's going to be done. So we assume this will be published very soon. And then we go 2 years into the autumn of 2026. And until then, the European Commission, and we will have a new European Commission because we just had elections, they will have time to adopt AI and DI. These are implementing acts and delegating acts. So actually, what we could call guidelines that we're going to implement this. And then hopefully in autumn 2028, this will start working, and we should then expect to have a full European health data space by 2030. So you might invite me back in a handful of years and I can give you an update. Anyway, so this is my last slide because this is ambitious for sure, and implementation, even we have until 2030, I guess will be a challenge. There will need to be substantial infrastructure investment, as I already mentioned, in digitized infrastructure, some more in one member states than others. We are already unevenly digitized, and of course also unevenly digitized in healthcare when it comes to healthcare. And this will also be highly depending on public trust, because who would like to share their most intimate healthcare data with the government or whoever they see stands behind the European health data space? The more critical ones will be concerned about cybersecurity. There will be ethical discussions around the secondary use. And one of the big discussions we had while the proposal was on table was whether patients could whether the system should be an opt-in or an opt-out system. So whether patients across Europe could say, well, I want to share my data, so that's opt-in. And I went to Brussels and said, from an EMA perspective, opt-in doesn't make any sense when it comes to secondary use, because it will only be a subgroup of very altruistic and dedicated citizens who want to opt in, and what about the rest? So it ended, luckily, on an opt-out model. And there may even be allowed for different opt-out options in the member states. So you can say, well, I'm okay having the majority of my data, but I want to opt out on my genetic data, or I want to opt out on other sets of data. This will hopefully mean that we will have a representative data set of Europeans, but it could also mean that patients with certain diseases want to opt out. What about patients with psychiatric illnesses that are concerned about Big Brother watching you or whatever? Would they like to share their data? I don't know, but I mean, you're just speculating. We could end up in a situation where we will have to discuss the representativeness of the data in the data. Let's see how big the opt-out actually will be. But that also comes back to the public trust, of course, and we've seen with the COVID-19 vaccine uptake. There are countries in Europe where the vaccine uptake has been enormously low, despite the government doing a big effort, but patients don't trust, citizens don't trust the government. So why should they, if they don't want to take a vaccine because it's recommended by the government, why should they share their data with the government? Huh? So we're going to have a big challenge also there in building trust. And then also ethical issues around the secondary use, what is being used for. But I think that's where, coming back to the layer cake slide, I show you that this data access board will be the one that is you will agree, you have to agree, and there needs to be a set of ethical standards on what kind of analysis you can do. So these are the challenges, and this is another challenge, but if you want to reach out to me, feel free, here's my email address. And I said to you, Rebecca, you're welcome to share my slides. I put in deliberately some hyperlinks at the bottom if you want to dig into the details. Many thanks.
Thank you so much. I think we have a mic for those that want to ask questions, and I also have some questions coming in from online, so
Good.
I'll moderate those here. So if you have a question, if you could raise your hand, and Julie will bring the mic over to you. You should use it. Okay, I'll also use a mic. So questions, if you could raise your hand, otherwise I'll go. Okay, great. Up front here. Thank you so much, Steffen. I'll start off by saying, before your presentation, it was a little nebulous to me. I've read a lot about the EHDS and CTIS, but this made this much more clear to me, and thank you for your very candid presentation.
To be honest, Rebecca, it was also a little bit nebulous to me when you, not your invitation, but the details of EHDS. So this has also been helpful for me because I had to dig a level deeper, because I've been much more involved in Darwin and what we do there. So that part of the similarities are understood. But the bigger picture that I showed you in some of the slides was, to be honest, I hadn't read the proposal in that level of details, because, again, I think we had that discussion last night, and I think you also grasped that from my presentation. The European Medicines Agency is not going to be the main driver of implementing this. Mm-hmm. We have a huge interest in the secondary use of the data that this system hopefully will bring.
Right, and we're also interested in secondary use, of course. So, question, if you could tell us your name and affiliation, and then your question.
Sure. Hi, Steffen. I'm Matt Ritelli from Eli Lilly and Company, and thank you for that. That actually, for me, made things much more clear. One of the questions I had is that in that middle layer, where I agree 100%, there needs to be some ethical principles established. But is that also going to be federated analysis, or will the data actually come into that area? That's going
to be a federated model. So that will build on the federated model. So depending on the type of question and the databases you want to get access to, that middle layer, the data access governance board, or whatever it was called, will then request the data in a federated model. So you'll get the data into this data holder, equivalent to the satellites you had on the Darwin, and that's where the analysis will be. So the data will stay local. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then, can I do one more? From a trust perspective, how much opportunity is there for public input or deliberation as the overarching EHDS is being developed? Because I think that's, you can't just implement it and then say, here, please opt in or opt out.
Good
Swallow.
question.
Yeah, of course, there have been a lot of opportunities for public consultation during the legislative process. But to be honest, I don't think if you stop a man on the street in Amsterdam and ask him on his view on the European health data space, he will think I've been smoking something, which you can do in Amsterdam, of course. But anyway, I think there will be. I don't know how that is built into the process, but there will certainly be a need to have that consultation as part of the trust-building process. So patients, and not even patients, I keep saying patients, I'm too much a doctor here, citizens will need to understand that this is for the greater good, which means also for their own good. Yeah. So there's going to be need for consultations and explanations. Education. Because I'm pretty sure there will be a lot of citizens who can see the benefit of the primary use to say, oh, okay, I can take out my app and I can see all my, I got all, and I think many healthcare systems already offer some kind of access to health records or results of blood samples and so forth, but being able actually to take them with you across Europe, I think many patients or citizens can see that benefit. But when it comes to the secondary use, and if we are not explicit about that there will be an opportunity for secondary use, then we will lose trust immediately, because then it will be seen like the deep state is digging into our data. So that's a good question. I don't know the details, but I certainly agree with you.
Okay. Can you raise your hands high?
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm David Peliquin. I'm a lawyer here at Ropes & Gray in Boston. I advise a lot of pharmaceutical companies and academic medical centers in the US and elsewhere on secondary uses of data. And one of the challenges I've seen for the last 10 years or so are questions arising, and you alluded to this in your remarks, about the GDPR and how that interplays with research uses of data. And one of the challenges for secondary research that a lot of people have run into is, well, what is the basis for processing those data under the GDPR? They're all sensitive, special categories of data, usually subject to heightened protection. And sometimes we have seen guidance from the European Data Protection Board and others that has not necessarily facilitated those uses, I think it's fair to say. And so the question I would have is, what consultation has happened with the European Data Protection Board and others that enforce GDPR to ensure that some of those issues around basis of processing won't become a roadblock for the secondary use of data from the health data space?
Without being a detailed legislative expert here, my understanding is that the European Commission is very aware that the General Data Protection Regulation is a big hurdle, and that they need to take that carefully into consideration. And well, they created the law themselves, so I'm pretty sure there has been discussions there, and there will be ongoing discussions. How are we going to create a system that is compliant with the laws and regulations we already have in place?
Right, thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Other questions?
Yeah, we got a lady there. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Chapman from the MRCT Center. Thank you so much for this overview. It seems like there's clear benefits to this effort, and you know, you mentioned the ethics committees and some of the challenges related to that. I was wondering if there's been, you know, dedicated, you know, consideration of potential risks for the secondary use, and you know, it seems like maybe less risk to any individual contributor, but in particular, I'm interested in, group risks and how that might be mitigated. Thank you.
There have been a lot of discussions, and I haven't followed them closely, but been part of a few of them in the European Parliament and in the European Commission, inviting patient organizations and so forth to express their views. And again, I think what I heard is mixed feedback. Some or most patient organizations see the obvious benefit, both for the individual patient, but also for the opportunity to, better access to healthcare and also for research. But again, have concerns around the secondary use and who is going to be able to do secondary use. Will it be governmental bodies like the EMA? Will it be pharma industry? Would it be academic researchers and so forth? And as I understand it, so far the plan is that going to be governmental agencies and academic institutions with a well-planned and approved research protocol. At a later stage, maybe industry, but I don't think industry will be the first that get access to this kind of data. Again, out of a privacy, and I think it'll be a challenge to convince citizens that industry, independent of industry having good intentions to do this, I don't think at least to start off with, that's my impression.
Thank you. Ben Rhodes?
Hi, thank you. As she said, Ben Rhodes from Eli Lilly. And I think I remember on your slide when you were showing the three bars, there was a section about the results would be published 18 months after. So is the plan to include, similar to a clinical trial registration results type of activity, where the question would be registered with the study plan and then the results would be posted in that type of format?
I assume so, but I don't think we have that. That's not been specified in the legislation yet, but I think that will be part of the implementing act and delegating act, because what we've done with Darwin is that we run this via the network of pharmacoepidemiological studies, so you can actually see the study protocols being published there, and when the results come out of the Darwin network, they get posted there, and of course many of them end up in a publication, and I'm pretty sure the Commission will look to the same, because we cannot, they're going to be somewhere fundamentally. So yes, that would be my assumption.
Okay, and my second question, which is unrelated, is there any plan that health technology assessments or payers would be using the same type of system to try and get background?
That will be my understanding, but this will be the unified European health data space. So pricing and reimbursement bodies, STA bodies, will of course get access as well if they like and have studies. Yeah.
Dawei Lin, NIAID, NIH. I wonder if there's any individual countries in European that may use the similar framework to do it as an experiment, before as a European-wise.
That's a good question. I don't think some of the Nordic countries have a very widely developed digitized healthcare system, but I don't think there is to the same level of detail. There might be primary access. I think I'm looking back thinking in Denmark I can access pretty all my healthcare records, but there is not a unified secondary use access. So that will be depending on it's governed by, in the Nordic countries where there are a lot of registers, it's governed by a data governance board, where you, or maybe public research institutions, so you'll have to go via that governance board, a little bit like the middle of the layer cake, and say, here's my research question, I want to look into how many patients got prescription of Viagra last year, and how many of them were males, and how old were they, and did any women get it? This kind of question. But you'll have to come with a research question.
Okay. I'm going to go to a few questions online, and then we'll tap back to the room. So one of the questions is, there is now, as of a few months, an ethics committee group run by the EU Commission. This is helping information sharing and process streamlining. There's also an ongoing project for regulators and ethics committees to work together and streamline their assessment timelines and requests to sponsors. The CTIS application integrates applications to both regulatory authorities in one applications.
I fully agree.
Yeah, so,
But thanks for pointing that out, that they are work, and maybe I was a little bit too rough on pointing fingers at the ethics committees, but so
I don't
far
know
it's
if that's
been
a
a challenge,
question,
but I think it's
that's what he's thinking. And maybe, I'm sorry, that I thought that was a question, but I guess it's not.
I thank for the clarification.
So will Switzerland be part of this effort for secondary use access?
Oh, say that again.
Will Switzerland be part of this effort for secondary use access?
Potentially, yes.
Okay. So there's subtle differences in the way EU countries look at anonymization. What is the expectation regarding the harmonized approach across EU countries on this?
Well, there needs to be some kind of harmonization if this is going to work, and I think that's part of the, first of all, now the European politicians have agreed that this is the way we're going to go. There will need to be work done in the individual member states to achieve the data infrastructure, do the discussions with the public. So a lot of the success of this is also depending on how national politicians is going to explain this to their citizens.
Okay, great. And the last question I'll ask is, will the EDCTP sponsored trials also be part of the CTIS? So there's a couple of CTIS questions, so that's the last one I'll ask.
Every clinical trial run in Europe, if it's a clinical trial, not registered trials, but clinical trials, has to go in CTIS.
Okay, great. Okay, let's go back to the room.
I was curious about.
Could you say your name
Oh,
and
I'm sorry,
affiliation,
Barbara
please?
Steiner from Mass General Hospital.
Oh, wonderful.
I'm curious about the risks of hacking and risks of government changeovers and security of data for people who have signed up. I'm sure that's been something you all have discussed. And the other question I have is there a way to have an anonymized set of secondary data instead of, so that you could be part of a database like that but not have your name associated with it for protection, or at least for...
The hacking question, I'm pretty sure everything will be done to avoid that.
Right.
And there are all the, I showed you all the different legislation on cybersecurity and so forth. To be honest, and that's my private opinion, I don't think we will ever create a system that is 100% watertight. That's, I can see how many hacking attacks the European Medicines Agency gets on a daily basis. We would be interesting to lay that down, whoever is trying to do that. And of course, they're also interested in getting access there to company confidential data, which we are storing. So I don't think we can completely exclude. I think we are going, and I'm pretty sure we're going to do our utmost to make sure that this is a secure system at the highest level. And your second question, sorry, I forgot that.
One question was if there's, I guess if people would like to be part of this,
Yeah,
be
the anonymous,
so
right?
that to
Yeah,
protect their identity.
yeah. I don't think there are any plans to say, well, I want to contribute with my data, but I want to be anonymized, because then to what do you want to anonymize? Do you want to anonymize your age, your gender, your social economic? We will have enormous checkbook on what we are going to leave out, because knowing that there is a person with hypertension, we don't know it's a woman, how old she, that doesn't make any sense from a research perspective. I think that the crux of the matter is that you deliver you put your data in, but the security and the anonymization lies in the middle layer, that those who do the data mining, do the studies, cannot see who you are, and they cannot take any data out that can identify you. And then, of course, the next question is, and that's also something we are being challenged when it comes to publication of clinical trials. If we are working, or if we get an application for an orphan drug in a very orphan space, you can actually or there is the potential that you can de-identify patients by going backwards, because if you have a trial with, let's say, 50 patients in a very rare condition, first of all, the patient community knows who those 50 patients are, and then backtracking a female who is 24, then you can suddenly, it's going to be those two girls over there. Mm-hmm. So, but anyway, I think we will do our utmost to protect that you can be re-identified. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Because
I think
it's
we're gonna
nobody's
move.
interest to be identified.
Thank you so much. So that was a great session. I think we're going to move on because of time to the next panel. If you didn't get your question in, you'll be able to ask Dr. Thirstrup your question during the panel. We will have a Q&A. So thank you. I'd like to invite... Sure. Okay, so we're just bringing up our panelists, but I will introduce the other panelists that are with us today. And we're bringing up our other panelist from FPIA, but I'll introduce our others. We all know Dr. Thirstrup, who's sitting to my left. Next to him is, so I'm just going to introduce everyone by name, title, and affiliation. And then I'm going to give each of them 1 minute to introduce themselves regarding their interest in the EHDS and their relevant experience in data reuse. Okay, so to the left of Steffen is David Leventhal from Pfizer. David is the head of data sharing and disclosure at Pfizer. So to the left of David is another David, David McAllister. So if you direct your questions to either David, please let us know which David it is. So David McAllister, professor from the University of Glasgow. David is also with us and also does research on Vivli, but also a lot more. So hopefully you'll let us know a bit more about your research. And then on screen with us from FPIA is Annette Tiskowitz, Director of Digital and Data from FPIA. So thank you for joining us, Annette. Could you say something so we can hear your audio?
Yes, good morning. I hope that you can hear me.
Yes, it sounds wonderful. Thank you, Annette, for joining us. Okay, so I'll start with you, David. Would you like to give us a short 1-minute introduction? David Leventhal. Sorry, David L.
This is going to happen the whole
Yes,
time.
multiple times.
So thanks, everybody. I'm David Leventhal, and
A little closer to the mic,
closer?
please. Yes.
Okay. Yes, I lead our data sharing and disclosure activities at Pfizer. We sustain our commitments to open science, and I think that's evidenced through our partnership with Vivli. And I think our interest here, of course, is how do we make this all work? We are committed to data sharing as part of what it is that we do. We just have to. There's a lot of devil in these details, and but I also think there's tremendous opportunity. On top of what will be potentially difficult, I think the opportunities around clinical trials and how we recruit, retain, and treat our participants in the conduct of those trials can be enabled through EHDS. So I view it as a great opportunity and look forward to talking more about the challenges, but also where we should pull together to work on these problems.
David McAllister.
Okay. So yeah, my name's David McAllister. Thanks very much for inviting me, Rebecca.
Of course.
Great fun. So I am a clinical academic, so qualified as a doctor, work in the research space, and I've worked in secondary analysis of data for about 15 years. When Steffen was presenting it, the first ever routinely collected healthcare data project I did, I got the data on a CD that was posted to us. So we've come a really long way in 15 years. 90,000 patients on a CD, you'd get arrested for that now. So I work at the University of Glasgow. I do secondary analysis of routinely collected healthcare data and over the past 7-8 years, individual participant data from clinical trials. I also work for Public Health Scotland, which is our national data agency in Scotland. I did a lot of work there during the pandemic, looking at risk of COVID in different populations. And I also work for NICE, which is the UK regulator who approves drugs or not. I sit on one of the health technology committees there. And yeah, it was really exciting to hear about all the plans.
Thank you, David. And Annette.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Thank you very much again for having me. So I represent the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations, and we overall represent over 2,000 companies of all sizes operating in Europe. I already took actually a liberty to start answering some of the questions in the chat during Steffan's presentation. I hope, Stefan, that you don't mind, but I have to say that I've been literally living and breathing the EHDS for the last 6 years. So I have been involved in the discussions during the negotiations of that file, presenting the industry position, and now I will be also following and sharing the industry views during the implementation period. So from the perspective of the innovation-based industry, this is obviously a critical proposal that can contribute to the innovation-friendly ecosystem. Although there are certain challenges related to its implementation and greater clarity is needed. And that's also, it's certainly been proved in the number of questions you've posed about some of the key provisions. And we cannot really answer all of these questions because they are not defined in the final text of the EHDS. Hence, I'm very much looking forward to this discussion to discuss the different roles also in the industry would have in that future framework. Will be data, obviously users, potentially benefiting from this more consistent data access models, but at the same time will be data holders and will be obliged to share a broad range of different data to the ecosystem. So thank you.
Thank you, Annette. I do think this is the perfect panel to start discussing both these opportunities and really the challenges of this bold initiative. I really have to congratulate EMA for coming forward and discussing. I know you won't be actually implementing this, but that you're here really on the hot seat a bit, Steffen, to come forward and discuss this. I do, before you were here, it was hard for me, I have to be quite frank, to see what the opportunities were, but I do see that this is the potential to be a transformative opportunity for all of Europe. And we're here really to discuss this. I see some parallels with GDPR. In the early days, we weren't sure what it was. It was a bit nebulous, and I do see the forms of what this could potentially be for us. So thank you. So let me kick off with a few questions. I think we can really keep this interactive and discuss this. So let me start with us here today. And Annette, in some ways we can talk about how this EHDS framework, and as you mentioned, boost overall competitiveness. And could you elaborate perhaps how you see, Steffen had mentioned the RWE initiatives. I was really captivated by the possibility of RWE. We've talked about this even in the US, of how that might be used. And you had mentioned, Steffen, on how that might be able to fill some gaps in therapeutic areas where treatments are currently unavailable. Perhaps you could speak about this, or Steffen, both of you, but maybe start us off, Annette, on your thoughts there on how the industry sees that.
Yes, thank you very much. And indeed, you've mentioned competitiveness. I think that now Europe is definitely shifting its attention into boosting its competitiveness, and certainly paving a way to more evidence-based, data-driven decision-making would be an important accelerant in that context. But moving back to the European health data space and more sort of where the industry sees the potential, but also what are still the aspects that needs to be addressed. So representing the innovative-based industry, where data is critical to all what we do, from identifying trends to testing hypotheses to developing the medicines and monitoring their performance in real life, it is all very much dependent on the availability of data. And in order to fill the gaps in our knowledge on the areas where the current therapeutic options are not existent or not satisfactory, we now complement this knowledge generated in a strictly controlled environment in the randomized clinical trials with real-world data. So there is a great potential of real-world data to answer the questions that otherwise would not be answered. It can help us in gathering information from the diverse population that sometimes for ethical reasons would not be included in clinical trials, as well as it can finally accelerate the development of innovative solutions for patients with rare diseases, where the patient sample size is too small to conduct research. So there is a great potential with that. Nonetheless, as you know, and many of you also alluded in your questions, Europe is highly fragmented when it comes to access to data, so that's mainly related to the divergent interpretation of GDPR. We have an issue with the quality of data because from the outset, the data during the collection is not meant to meet the highest scientific standards. And also we have the poor interoperability of systems of different frameworks, which again prevents us from collecting the data from across different member states, across different databases. So with this in mind, the European health data space has a potential to drive greater consistency interpretation of GDPR by providing us with a one-stop shop in every member state of the health data access body to access the data from and also have a sort of a visibility on what type of data is being available in every member state. It can drive greater standardization in the very important types of data like electronic health records, like patient registers that hold valuable information about patients. At the same time, it can, as I already mentioned before, can provide this consistent sort of data access models. Nonetheless, again, its success would very much depend on providing the right balance between sharing a broad range of different data types, while at the same time providing the clarity on obligations for data holders and data users. And as an industry, we have been already quite diligent and we've been starting to prepare for the implementation of the EHDS. Nonetheless, without further clarity on the actual interpretation of these key fundamental provisions, this is not possible. Hence, our position is to the European Commission, to the European Union, to start working together with the stakeholders, with the industry that has a long sort of knowledge of working and accessing and using the data in a strictly controlled environment for the sort of greater public good to develop medicines. So in terms of the provisions that are particularly relevant for us, and I've seen that many of you ask the questions about them, are even about the territorial scope of the HDS, which is not defined, as GDPR has an extraterritorial scope, or the AI Act, what that has recently adopted, and certainly you have heard of it, it's very clear that it has an extraterritorial scope. For the HDS, we do not know. The opt-out, member states can decide how they want to implement it. So it can really cause a very fragmented approaches, not mentioning that it will have an impact of data availability on the diversity of data that is being available for research, but also it will impact on the public-private partnership in Europe. More importantly, also, we would be obliged to share a broad range of data that we currently have, including the data from clinical trials. However, the data categories are still, I would say, rather broadly defined. And for example, the genetic data can be held in different databases by the pharmaceutical industry. So we need to exactly understand in which format, what type of data shall be made available. And at the same time, I would say that we will be obliged to share the data containing intellectual property and commercially sensitive information, and the data holder will not have a right to refuse access to data because that would be health data access body acting as an intermediary and deciding whether such data shall be shared with data user. There are also some aspects related to international transfer of data that we think need to be clarified as early as possible, giving a more liberty to member states to add additional safeguarding mechanisms where data shall be shared outside of the EU. So as you can see, there is still many questions to be answered. Although, again, this is really the great potential, definitely.
Thank you so much for giving us a broad scope of, some of the challenges as well as some of the promises of the health data space. And you covered them fairly broadly. I mean, David McAllister, what are your thoughts? I mean, I think Annette covered them, broadly, but as a researcher, I'd love to hear your perspective on, this is obviously in the future, but you've access data both from Vivli as well as other spaces. And what are your thoughts on how you might access data in the future health data space as you understand it at this time? You know, both RWE and other types of perhaps clinical trial data.
So-
And the usefulness and utility.
Yeah. So researchers obviously like to do research. So I think one of the key issues is, you know, is the trial data, is it going to be individual level participant data that we're able to access through this federated system, or is it going to be aggregate? If it's going to be aggregate, what kind of aggregate data? Is it going to look like a kind of table 1 in a published trial paper, or are we going to get something a little bit finer grained, maybe some information about joint variables? Either is fine. The type of research questions we can answer with individual level participant data are different, but you can still do lots of really interesting things with aggregate data. You know, you can study trial representativeness. You can even do things like reweight trials to try and improve the representativeness. You can look at underserved populations. You can do lots of interesting kind of research about research. I think that a really key issue is going to be discoverability and finding out early what you're going to be able to get and whether it's going to be useful. You don't want to go through a 2-year process and then get data and find out that it's absolutely no use to you. So I think that we need to think hard about metadata, you know, data about the data and standards for that, making it machine readable, kind of interoperability, thinking about the role of kind of synthetic data, not synthetic data for making inferences, which is really hard, but synthetic data for knowing what the data will look like, which is, you know, much easier. So that's what I'd like to say. And in terms of as NICE, you know, the kind of regulators, there it's aggregate data you want. You know, do the people in this trial look like the kind of people who have this disease and who might be considered for this treatment?
Yes. I mean, Steffen, any reaction to what David just said?
No, first of all, Annette, thank you for answering some questions online. You've been much closer to the legal discussions in Brussels than I have been, so you know much more details. No, I completely agree with you, David. And the proof is in the pudding here. We need to see where this will go in terms of utility of these data. Thinking about your previous question about real-world evidence, Rebecca, you know, we are very keen on utilizing and establishing the use of, because this is going to be real-world evidence that comes out of Darwin. And sometimes I've been asked, isn't it just the good old retrospective studies you're talking about? And is it just old wine on new bottles, or maybe just old wine with a new label? But we want to go beyond the use for pharmacovigilance and safety monitoring. We want to establish real-world evidence as a supplement to the data that we, and supplement, that's the important word here, to supplement to data from randomized controlled trials. Last year I was in a meeting with cardiology trialists and talking about real-world evidence, and it was like swearing in church. Because they only believe in randomized controlled trials. So talking about real-world evidence was definitely a no-go. So I had to repeatedly explain to these guys that I'm talking about supplementing the evidence from the randomized controlled trials. And I think this is important, and as I told you, this is my 3rd conference this week, and the 2 past conferences had been on digital health technologies and on decentralized clinical trials. And collecting digitized data in a decentralized clinical trial is actually also generating real-world evidence.
Yes.
So it will mean that you have a randomized, the golden standard clinical trial that also have a component of real-world data. And I think that's suddenly become interesting, not only for us as a regulatory authority in answering the question, did that clinical trial actually reflect or is the clinical trial reflective of the real world where the intended use of this product is going to be? And it will be maybe even more interesting for the payers downstream to say, how do we already now get a flavor of how this is impacting real life of patients in their decision making? And we could even go, and this is far, far outside my remit, but it's clear that the payment model for pharmaceuticals, where you pay per tablet fundamentally, is flawed for some therapies. New antibiotics to treat antimicrobial resistance, these products will be shelved. They are only to be used in certain cases. You will never get your investment back unless you have another payment model. Therapies for rare conditions, the same holds here. So we have to think about a pay-for-performance model or another payment model. And their real-world evidence is actually also relevant, because you could say then, of course, there will be pharma who gain from this. There definitely also be pharma who will lose from this, because clinical trial may either over or underestimate the clinical benefit of these products. But if you are going to be reimbursed based on real-world data, that's suddenly a new way of thinking.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, both of you. And David Leventhal, so, just following on from what Annette said, do you see, from the Pfizer perspective, EHDS providing either a consistent framework to support industry development, for example, in Pfizer, for example, in drug development, perhaps utilizing the real-world data?
I do, obviously. So Annette, I think, covered a lot of the challenges, so I don't need to belabor those. But I think there are real opportunities with tying interventional clinical trial data with real-world evidence, as you had indicated. But I think there are some details there around, well, what does that mean around tokenization? Do we have to start thinking about that as a common practice when we're initiating clinical trials? And again, we live in a world, and I'm not going to speak as industry, but I think as sponsors of clinical research, live in a world where we're not supposed to know the identities of those individuals. So how do you ensure the privacy and confidentiality of those individuals while making sure that it is tied to their electronic health record? But I think that creates tremendous opportunity. I think around clinical trial recruitment, which is dogs every sponsor of research, the ability to potentially have a geographic reach, understand, be able to do disease modeling geographically, and be able to offer clinical trial opportunities through EHDS to individuals and recruit them. I think that's an amazing opportunity. I think it also, from a retention perspective, we have the ability, presumably, to return the data from the clinical trial back to the individual. This is something that Pfizer has been working on in the United States, and we feel very strongly about. But now you potentially could actually have it show up in their electronic health record, which I think creates a great user experience for them. They're more likely to stay in the trial and not drop out. So I think there's tremendous opportunity there on top of the scientific power that comes from all of this, which I don't feel well equipped to represent, but the opportunity is great.
Of course. So, David McAllister, you mentioned aggregate data. So, Steffen, perhaps you should clarify for the audience, when you are sharing data eventually for clinical trials, would that be at the aggregate level or the patient level data?
Well, the data you currently can access on our website is aggregated data. You can request access to full data set, but that will very rarely be granted. You're going to have a good reason to do so. Again, coming back to my first slide where I spoke about the difference between US FDA and us, is that we rarely do our assessment based on the raw data. We request raw data from time to time, but we don't have the FDA approach of give us the data, we'll tell you the result. We actually trust the company's analysis and look. So we actually assess based on aggregated data in the file. But we are running a current project on raw data to see if raw data, with or without using real-world evidence as well, can improve improve our decision-making process. But the data you get, back to your question, Rebecca, is the data you get access to are aggregated data.
Okay, thank you. So, David McAllister, now that you've heard this, what challenges might arise from integrating this type of data into your work? Any thoughts about that? as a follow-on?
So, can I talk about an opportunity first?
Of course.
Because I think we have this world of trial data and this world of routinely collected healthcare data, and they don't meet very well. So, I mean, it sounds amazing. So, for example, you can look at, so many studies have been done where people have taken trial eligibility criteria and then applied that to a routine data set and said 10% of patients are eligible, 20%. And then similarly, you can look at the trial and you can say, okay, who's screened and then who gets through into the randomization. What would be great here is you could go from end to end. You could have kind of population-level data about who's actually getting into clinical trials, what they're like in terms of the index conditions and age and sex and race, ethnicity and comorbidity. So that would be a new opportunity, and I think that would be really exciting.
Yeah, and that's one that doesn't currently exist.
No, I don't think it does. The best you can do is kind of sort of stratify on patient characteristics and make guesses. So that would be brand new. Challenges, I think, are, you know, Hadley Wickham, this kind of R guru guy that's done lots of packages for the stats system. You know, he said that 90% of work in data analysis is data cleaning and harmonization. It's probably 98, you know. So, you know, if you've got a 5-year project, you'll spend 4 years and 11 months cleaning the data and then 1 month doing the analysis. So with this vast amount of data, the danger is you're just going to drown in data harmonization. So I think we need code sharing, we need standards. Researchers need to do better as well. You know, secondary researchers, we rely on other people's data. I'm not sure that we're as good at sharing our intermediate products as we should be.
Okay. So what questions do you have for each other? I know I've asked a lot of questions to you, but what questions do you have for each other? Annetta? I'll start with you.
Yes, thank you. I actually have a question to Steffen. So
Of course.
it's more about the future indeed and the incorporation of Darwin EU in the EHDS. So as far as I understood, Darwin EU will be also serving sort of as a node, or it would be EMA serving as a node. So I'm just thinking of how what EMA is creating now, you know, with Darwin EU, of how that would then somehow be incorporated at the broader scale. And then that's question linked to that. You've mentioned that the health data, that the HTA bodies might be also using that data to inform their decisions. That's obviously in long-term objective. So then how actually, if we have such a broad range of sources available that were not really maybe, I would say, curated somehow, if I can call it that way, how we ensure that they meet the highest scientific standards, that they provide the right question, right answers to the very specific questions that such an authorities might have.
Yeah, thank you for that, Annette. If we start with the discussion around the future of Darwin, whether Darwin at some point will be incorporated or metabolized by the European Health Data Space, maybe in a distant future, yes. But I think to start off with, we will keep Darwin, again, now it has been a pathfinder, but maybe moving forward more as an experimentation room where we can potentially also, we don't know how fast access we can get to data in the health data space, as I alluded to in my presentation. So maybe we need to have Darwin as a fast access to answer urgent regulatory questions. I don't think we have made up our final mind on where this will go, but as I see it, and we have until 2030 to do our thinking as well, I think we will maintain Darwin as a separate system with those data partners that serves specific purposes for quick regulatory decision making. In terms of the validity of the research questions, and again, we don't know how this is going to work in details for the health data space, but the way we've done it in Darwin, as I guess you know, Annette, we have this data review board at Erasmus, at the coordination center. So you eventually submit your research protocol that is then being scrutinized, kind of peer reviewed, and we don't say yes to all the products, all the protocols, and maybe some of the protocols need to be tweaked. So we make sure that the research question is relevant and potentially, hopefully also relevant from a regulatory perspective, and that the research is being done, it's scientifically valid. And I think we need to keep the flag high here, because if it could also be a reputational damage to the European health data space if we see a lot of scientifically low standard, crappy, maybe not even real research coming out of it, being misused, being turned into misinformation and disinformation. It's in nobody's interest. So I think we need to have a similar system for the European health data space, where we make sure that the research questions are valid, or at least that the protocols are scientifically valid. Did that answer your question, Annette?
Mm-hmm. It seems like, yes, it seems like there's so much riding on this, Health Data Access Board, or the governance. And, having set up Vivli, I realize there's so much that people think about is, around the technical piece, but the governance really has to be thought about very closely. And I'm sure that you're really putting a lot of effort into that. So, David Leventhal, I know your team at Pfizer is probably thinking a great deal about the rollout of this. And can you tell me just a bit, whatever you can share, about the steps that you're thinking about mitigating some of the challenges? We've spoken a lot about that. Annette has talked about this, and I'm sure companies like yours are thinking about how to mitigate any of the bumps in the road that we saw with GDPR and the lessons that we've learned with GDPR. What are you thinking about to ensure a smooth transition? I know it's years down the road, and the lessons learned there.
Yeah, so I can talk about what we're doing at Pfizer, but I also think industry as a whole is taking some steps. So operational readiness, well, I'm an operations person, so that's primarily what we're looking into. What is the headcount that we're going to need to manage all of this? What is the do we have to have a catalog of studies that we make available? And in many cases, we're using kind of all the questions when we signed on with Vivli. What is it that we need to do to be able to fulfill requests through Vivli? And I think it's an interesting question. What role does Vivli potentially play in the EHDS structure, either as a teaching opportunity or even as a potential service provider in such a world? So we're looking at, okay, what is the projected demand? What do we have to do around preparation of our studies for sharing, the anonymization schemas and the governance around all of that? So those are swirling as we're trying to figure this all out. We are also thinking about the opportunities, right? So I mentioned things like tokenization. So there'll be there's the past of clinical trials, and then there's the future of clinical trials. So what do we need to do to prepare those studies that have happened in the past? And some of them are even things on paper where you have to go and find things in boxes, or preparing data. And then what does the future look like? So what is this new thing? Are we tokenizing each of our clinical trial participants so that they can link together with the electronic health record within Europe? How do we separate the European participants from the rest of world participants, and how do we make sure that those are not getting that the data protections are in place for those individuals? And so, I think there's a broad question for us, and I'd like David McAllister to chime in. So for a large pharma company which has resources to be able to do this, this is going to apply to all sponsors of research. So the little investigator at a university who has a very limited budget, they too will be called upon to do this. And how do we create whatever subsidies or whatever it is to raise all the boats so that we can operate in this space? So there's a lot there, but that's kind of the things that we're thinking about. The last bit is that there is this work through the Innovative Health Initiative called the Share HD project, where we're going to try to answer these questions around anonymization and governance and CCI and making sure that data privacy concerns are addressed and that we can both influence but also play in the space operationally.
Thank you so much for that thoughtful answer. I hadn't thought about investigators, which I'm not sure why I hadn't thought that, as they run their own clinical trials, they will have to also comply with this. And that's actually a large audience that will have to think about this very thoughtfully as they comply with this, initiative. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to turn to questions from the audience. We do have some rolling in virtually, but if you have questions, you want to raise your hand, we can take them to the panel and bring them. I do have, go ahead, question? Dan, is it Dan?
It's Matt.
Oh, Matt, sorry.
Yeah, Matt Rotelli from Eli Lilly. Thank you. So I think, obviously governance is going to be very, very important. It sounds like, for example, for Darwin, you have a governing body set up to do approval. Are there documented scientific and ethical principles that governance body uses? And if so, can they be published? And then also, is there any transparency into the ongoing projects, not just the completed projects?
I'm unsure about the whether there's a written governance structure. I'm pretty sure there is. That I have to say, I don't know in details what happens there. With regard to projects, yes, if you submit a project to Darwin, as it is now, it's going to be submitted. There is a database for pharmacoepidemiological studies in Europe. It has yet another acronym, which I've forgotten on the top of my head here, but it will be published there. So already when you have the protocol, your protocol will be there, and the results will come there afterwards. But Dave, now I have the microphone. You said something that triggered something in my head about the off-the-shelf studies, because that's also the way we have been thinking in Darwin, that there may be certain studies that we want to run on a regular basis, annually, biannually, to look into how things are developing. So these we call off-the-shelf studies. And so there we have a protocol, we have an algorithm that we can apply to our data, and we can get the answer within weeks. And then we will have studies that will more be commissioned based on a question that comes out on a product-related issue or committee-related issue, and then maybe broader, longer-scale scientific relevant studies looking into drug utilization. So we will have different sets of studies, and some of them, and again, we don't know how fast we're going to be able to do things in the health data space, but being able to run an algorithm quickly on a set of data to get an update on how is the situation is also important from a regulatory perspective. And that could be regulatory going beyond the Medicines Agency. That could be the Center for Disease Control that could have an interest in chipping into data in the health data space to see how an epidemic is developing or resistance is developing among bacteria. So I see a lot of opportunities here to do quick checks on health, if possible.
Yeah, I'll just say, I see tremendous opportunities here, but to the point, like, you're going to have to carry the public along with us, and we're going to have to be very, very transparent. And I think that's where, no matter how robust internally we think we have things set up, being able to verbalize that, and frankly, even getting input through the education and interactions as we set it up will be key to the success of this, because then I think people will be more comfortable with contributing their data, with tokenization of their clinical trial data, so that it can be matched up with this. And all those things are really going to come from having that foundation of trust, and that's where I think we need to get the principles in place, get them out in front of the public, and carry everybody along with us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Matt. I have a question from Fergus Sweeney.
Hi, Fergus.
Fergus, Steffen says hi. Can researchers and developers ask questions to be answered by Darwin? For example, on a particular cancer prevalence in the EU, and the demographic and other characteristics of the patient population for that particular tumor or tumor type?
Who can ask questions?
Can researchers ask ask
Yeah, fundamentally,
questions
yes.
to be answered by Darwin.
In principle, yes, they can submit the protocol to Darwin and have that reviewed. Yes, so that's fundamentally possible. Sponsors or commercial sponsors, at the moment, I don't think can do this. But of course, they could go for scientific advice at EMA and say, we have this issue, and then we could do the data analysis. Thanks for that question, Fergus.
Can I just only confirm that indeed that sponsors do not have the same possibility. We can only actually weigh in when there is evidence has been used on a complex study. So just to clarify that that's correct, actually. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Annette. Yes, David?
Sorry, Rebecca, I was wondering if I could come back on the protocol question.
Of course, yes,
Just because
absolutely.
I think that, from industry, you're usually thinking about clinical questions. I mean, I know in drug development they do really innovative statistics and things, but I think for the protocol, if you're asking the question, does this drug work in older people? You want a highly detailed protocol that you're going to follow before you even open the data. But if you're asking a question like, what's the best way to fit a statistical model when I have partially redacted anonymized data? You're probably going to discover what you're doing as you go along. So I would like to see a protocol submission system that's appropriate to the type of research question being asked.
Excellent point. Thank you. David Leventhal, did you have a point or any thoughts before we move on?
No.
Okay.
Happy.
Thank you.
Next question.
Any other questions from the audience before we move on to the virtual questions? Okay. Another one from Matt from Brigham.
Into it, but there we go. I have to
Okay,
brush
thanks.
my teeth really hard with this one. I agree 100% that it needs to be customized and that different types. But one of the things I think we have to be very cautious of is we have seen in the past how sometimes retrospective observational research can have a really big impact on policy decisions, and that needs to be very, very reliable. It's a different approach, different methodology relative to a randomized clinical trial, but when it's going to have that kind of impact, there needs to be the appropriate rigor, validation, plan in place for it, and there needs to, again, be these principles. But I do think those principles need to be right-sized for the type of questions. That's a fantastic point.
I think one other, I'll take the opportunity then. I think around pragmatic trials, and as you say, not having direct access through Darwin, I mean, many of these pragmatic trials are done, in partnership with clinical care. I think you can work through kind of a sub-I or, work in partnership to answer some of these pragmatic questions and then get the answers that you would need, to kind of make some decisions as you would go into a more detailed, late stage, clinical trial. So.
Thank you. So how exactly will you link clinical trial data with the personal health records of a trial participant? There was some discussion of tokenization, and how will that work in practice?
Well, that's a pretty good question, and I don't think I know at the moment. I think it comes back to the point that Annette said that it's not described in detail in the legislation.
Okay.
We're gonna do implementing act and so forth before we can. But it's a good question. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions?
So while you think about questions and completely, well, not unrelated, but maybe a little bit off the topic here. Now we've been talking about real-world evidence. Health data space, digital literacy. We also need to think about the curriculum that is being taught at med school and pharmacy schools, because we are changing the paradigm around data. Not changing, but we are expanding the paradigm. So we need also to make sure that all the new doctors and research coordinators and pharmacists and so forth is aware of what is happening there. And to David McAllister's point, there's also a lot of new methods that are being developed here that we need to teach methodologists as well. So, yeah.
That's an excellent point, and maybe that's something that we could work with you, and we have a number of clinicians here that are we can talk about moving that forward. Chris? Yes, one last question. I'm getting a time check here.
Hi, thank you. Chris Wolston, Head of Science Policy for Sanofi. David Leventhal, I think I heard you suggest the possibility that industry may have to disaggregate the data in our clinical trials and select just the data from European participants, possibly to share back to the EHDS. That's not something I had considered before, but I mean, it's a very good point. And I'm wondering, and I don't know whether this is David McAllister or Steffen, how does that work in terms of the expectation and objectives of the EHDS if what you're going to get from the industry studies or any multi-regional study is an incomplete data set?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's an obvious one that, you know, we would only get we will get a part, yeah. From the primary use, it makes sense that you as a European patient where we have a data health base, you have been part of a global clinical trial, you take access to your own data. But of course, if you then want as a researcher to retrofit the clinical trial based on the data that you have in the health data space, that will be a no-go because not a no-go, it will not be scientifically valid because you will have a subgroup of the patient. But that being said, you may have data from a clinical trial of European patients that's taken together with other data from other clinical trials or from routine healthcare that can give you a picture. So I think it depends on your scientific question you put into the health data space.
If you can link the trial data with the real world data.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for our panelists today. We're now going to a break. We actually are starting off a data use implementation group that we're leading. If any of you are interested, we'd love to have you join us. And we're partnering with MRCT on this. So please join us. There's a QR code up here. So we're launching this shortly. So please do join us, and we'd love to have you join us in this work group. We are also having an upcoming webinar in January talking about navigating clinical trial data sharing under the new Declaration of Helsinki, and that is launching in January. So also these are two announcements. We'll toggle them during the break. So these are two things that are upcoming from Vivli and MRCT. So thank you so much. If you'd like to, interested in either one of us, see myself or Julie. So thanks again. And we have a 15-minute break. Please come back on time for our next session led by Barbara Beer.
It is something that we really want to understand because this is a source for research data driven by clinical data itself. So we're going to first hear from Irene. No, I know your last name. I was just making sure because this is on the, it's on the, not quite in the correct order. Irene Koch, the Executive Vice President and Chief Legal Officer at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York. And you will hear about why she has been invited. Jill DeGraff, the Vice President of Regulatory at Be Well Connected Health, and then David Pelequin, a partner at Ropes & Gray. So let me ask Irene to start this, if you could. And I do think it's worth spending a little bit of time on what a health information exchange is, because I'm not sure everybody knows.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for having me. With that introduction, you can tell we're sort of, at least I feel, a little bit like an alien who landed in this land of people who do something really different from what I do. particularly now, but even before that, when I was doing health information exchange, I'm really happy to talk about it. And kind of almost like a historian today for an example of something that happened in New York that I was involved in. So right now, for the last 10 years, I'm Chief Legal Officer at Hospital for Special Surgery, and I have an opportunity to lead the team there, and part of what one person does is research, and we are involved with health information exchange, but really only peripherally. But before I was at HSS, for 10 years, I was involved with the then budding health information exchange infrastructure in New York State, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So that's sort of why I'm here. I could try to explain, what health information exchange is, and I will try to do that. But I remember back in the day, and still, there's that adage, you've seen one HIE and you've seen one HIE, so they're all really different. But I guess just think of this sort of as an object lesson in building one of them in a state and how it evolved and how it sort of went from a regional thing to a statewide thing, and it evolves with changing technology, changing policies, and what that does to the understanding of the participants in it, because I think it is relevant to what we heard about today. What I would say is, from the slide that Steffen showed earlier, it was sort of like the top left corner. It was just the clinical data and data from different hospitals, doctors' offices, nursing homes, social service agencies now, trying to get that together in one place. And he is trying to do it, you guys are doing it for Europe. We were doing it at first in a region of New York State. And I remember as this process went on, a group from Italy came and, was sort of, we were just in awe because there was a national identifier and it made it so much easier. But now, see, things are sort of coming back again, and now you have all of Europe that doesn't have a national group identifier, so this will really maybe be relevant. So what happened was, in New York State, back in about 2005, I was a lawyer at a hospital that was forward-thinking and wanted to work on coordination of care between the hospital and nursing homes and other providers that referred cases to the hospital. And the state, at that point, had a grant program called the Health Efficiency and Affordability Law that was giving out a set of grants, about 25 of them or so, for entities to apply for and put together some infrastructure to beef up their digitization of electronic health records and to share among different entities. And so the hospital that I was working at, where from the legal side, which is where I was doing memorandum of understanding about people who were the different entities that were applying to be part of this grant together in a part of Brooklyn where I was, that was it. We got the grant, and it was scheduled to take off, but no one was really leading it. So I was a little bit ready for something new in my own career, and I said, I'll do it. So that happened, and for the next 10 years, I was building and leading, with the technology and the infrastructure, a health information exchange, which I'll tell you really evolved. It was the funnest thing I ever did. It was really creative and interesting, and still is. I'm still on the board of the entity that took that over, so I'm involved tangentially still. So the first thing that we needed to figure out was how we were going to share data between different entities where patients had come to those entities and had their data housed by them, but not allowed to share data across. And how are we going to bake that into the infrastructure? And I can tell you, research was not on anyone's mind at that point in time. It was a small grant. It was about getting data from about 6 entities at that point, all in one place, matching the patients with an electronic master person index so that Jane Doe at one place and Jane Doe at the other could match up, and with their address and their social security number with an algorithm, and then combining the data from the different entities into a consolidated view for treatment purposes. It was really all about the continuity of care and about improving treatment. And I suppose somewhere baked into that was the ability for the state to assess the effectiveness of the grant, but research was not really thought of. And it was all we could do was just to get the infrastructure to share data from 6 entities, match the patients up, and get it on a portal so that people, when they logged in, could see a consolidated view. And we did that, and it was really successful, and it was, fascinating with a very small team. And other grant recipients across the state did the same thing, but in a different way. And then the HEAL grants came with more money, and for a lot of the hospitals, that's how you get this stuff done. And we got 2 more big grants. And at that point in time, about 2006 to 2008, there was a statewide collaboration process that really launched in full force. And that was to get the buy-in, like we've talked about a little bit here today, and the trust of all the representatives of different constituents of folks who were in there who had data that needed to be treated with special care, the HIV population, there were genetics, there was reproductive rights. And how do you get all those people who aren't housing the data but have a say in it to buy into the process? Again, mostly for treating purposes. And the state at that point in time created a statewide entity, like a public-private partnership, to run this statewide collaboration process, and that entity was called the New York eHealth Collaborative, or NICE, but a different NICE than we heard about before. And then it was really how to link these different projects together so that people had common rules of the road for what they were doing in their regions of New York State. So there was upstate, there was the Albany area, there was Long Island, New York City, we still had Brooklyn, and they limited that now. It was like a shrinking number of these health information exchange projects. But that we would all sort of buy into the same concept of how consent should work, and how data security and how the participation agreements between our participants in each of our regional health information exchange hubs would work. So at first, the entities that were regionally established were called Regional Health Information Organizations, or RIOs. And then when the statewide collaboration process happened, they became changed into qualified entities, because now there was this qualification process to be part of the State Health Information Network of New York, which is called the SHINY. So there was all these acronyms all over the place, but you guys are used to that in a different world for research. So all the participants in the SHINY had to participate in this statewide collaboration process, and I was heavily involved in the privacy group. The different leaders of the different qualified entities. One was a pharmacist, one was a physician, one was a business person. And as a lawyer, I really had a vested interest and knowledge in the consent process. So it took thousands, tens of thousands of man-hours to sort of develop what was baked into everyone's infrastructure then, which ended up being a model for consent for sharing health information data across different entities that kind of turned the consent world on its head from what we knew about in the paper world. So the model was that in New York, in this first instance, and still to this day, the data is uploaded by each of the hospitals, physicians, nursing homes, et cetera, into the qualified entities infrastructure, without patient consent, because that's done under the provision of HIPAA, the privacy law in the United States, that allows an entity to sort of serve as an agent for each separate entity as a business associate. And so the data was already sent to this central entity who was acting as a business associate under these agreements to combine it and to link it, like I talked about before. But then, how do you get the data out? And so the consent didn't come from the patient at the point where you were disclosing it in the first place, because the data was already in there. Instead, we flipped it, and the data was shared when the patient gave consent at the point of access. And that sort of made sense because a patient, when they presented to one hospital, let's say, could decide in that moment whether they wanted that hospital to be able to pull the aggregated data from the region for that purpose. If you were to have done it the old way, you would have had a patient consenting to disclose information anywhere, like whenever in the future it was needed to be released, and that didn't really make sense from an informed consent perspective. Not that patients are reading these forms when they're coming into a hospital or a provider that carefully, but with education, we thought that that made sense. So that's the model that got baked into the Shiny. And the statewide collaboration process in 2008 published its first version of the statewide policies and procedures for privacy. And the word research was mentioned once. And for de-identified data, theoretically, it could be used for research if there was a data use agreement. And I think also if it was approved by an IRB. Again, it was sort of like this afterthought because it was really built for treatment. Fast forward, and I know I have to do this really quickly, and it's a whole world that happened for the now 15, 16 years after. But now we're on version 4.1 of those policies and procedures. The state has taken a more active role in terms of having a technical infrastructure to link the different qualified entities together in the Shiny so that when a request comes in at one place, you can get data not only from your own qualified entity, but the network of networks. And that's the sort of health information exchange because there's now a statewide electronic master person index that links each of the different qualified entity nodes into one and then pulls data when it's needed. But the policies and procedures have really evolved in terms of research over these years and now recognize a lot of sharing of de-identified data for purposes of that are not competitive with the Shiny. So it's not for commercialization, it's not for marketing, it's not for R&D, it's for research, for clinical research. And for de-identified data, there can be users that are outside of the participants of the Shiny, but it has to go through each of the qualified entities' policies and procedures. There's sharing of limited data sets under data use agreements as well. And there's sharing of data with consent for identifiable data as part of a clinical research study. There was never that thought in the beginning. It was only consent for treatment, but now there's a whole separate world of consent for sharing. And there's other uses of sharing protected health information for recruitment purposes, subject to appropriate safeguards and agreements, and for inclusion and exclusion criteria, and looking through the data to let people know whether their study design is going to work or not. So there's tons of detail in the policies that are already online in version 4.1, but on top of that, just a month ago, the state published a statewide common participation agreement, which is going to shift the paradigm again. And it gets a little bit more coercive each time as the state has put in more and more money and is linking its Medicaid program to the health information exchanges to help those populations. And now it seems like there's going to be less and less regional control over what participants have to agree to in terms of their own region. It's going to be more of a statewide standard protocol, and research hasn't really been addressed at all in what's being proposed there. They're going to develop standard operating procedures which will incorporate version 4.1 that I just talked about, but will evolve over time and perhaps not give the constituents who I talked about before as much of a say going forward because it'll be a little bit more state-run. So more to come on that. But I think that it's really interesting to see how the data that was put into these regional areas for one purpose has now shifted, it's used to others, and the norms of how we can do it technically, how things grow over time and how we grow to expect different things with data change how it's used for. And there's a lot of debate, I think we'll probably get into today, about whether that's right or wrong, but that is in fact what's been happening. And so I hope that was a very brief and helpful discussion about one model of health information exchange that happened in New York. And I'm happy to answer questions, presumably later.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but that was perfect.
Okay.
Thank you so
Okay,
much.
good.
Thank you. Jill?
Hi, everybody. My name is Jill DeGraff, and as Barbara said, I'm head of regulatory at Be Well Connected Health. So as I pick up from Irene, let me just give a little context about our company so you understand where I'm coming from. Be Well Connected Health was founded about 10 years ago, just under 10 years ago, at the forefront of bipartisan legislation that culminated in the 21st Century Cures Act, which, as you know, is a sentinel event for clinical research, precision medicine, but also a sentinel event for a point in time before which we were focusing on the digitization of medical records. And from 21st Century Cures Act forward, a prioritization now on the interoperability of that data on standards. And a lot of the work up to that point was being performed at a state or regional level through these health information exchanges. They were creatures of states, as Irene was expressing in New York. There were also EMR vendors that were beginning to build their own internal networks. There was an effort called the National Health Information Network to try to create something national in scope, and there were nonprofit alternatives that were being, or private options like Commonwealth Health Alliance as a health information network in order to allow permitted HIPAA use cases to drive interoperability of data in standardized formats. And I'm intrigued by the earlier conversation about the EU, where the concepts of public trust are so foundational in trying to develop a system. Trust is certainly foundational in that point in time for interoperability in two key respects. One is, given that there had already been enough maturity for some level of health information exchange, the desire was to actually make it possible for any participant in delivering treatment predominantly to have a single on-ramp to all of the networks rather than having to connect with all of the different, persist more fragmentation. And so we have something called the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement to link networks of networks together, including HIEs. And so I think what's interesting, just as a point of contrast with the European Union, is that with HIPAA, we have established a foundation or a default position of trust. If data is going to be exchanged for treatment, you don't need to have an individual involvement. Usually individuals at the point of care may not be even, it wouldn't be safe necessarily to withhold treatment until you got consent. And so that and other permitted HIPAA purposes, treatment, payment, healthcare operations, doesn't require a consent. There are permitted exceptions to that consent framework. But we have also seen, and the other piece around the 21st Century Cures Act was that data is so valuable, especially in digitized form, that there can be behaviors. Usually it's a business incentivized behavior to withhold the sharing of information even when it's permitted. And so we have a dynamic and a tension in our interoperability world today for making sure that data is flowing where it's required to be done. And so those purposes must be through networks, through standard interoperability infrastructure, treatment, payment, healthcare operations, and the patient right of access. And I think that's the one that I think is really interesting and goes back to Irene's point, which is that patient right of access is very consistent with the concepts around informed consent in the research context. It also is an affirmative right under HIPAA, and it also enables the data to flow for free because it's a patient's own data. And so that being said, it is the moment where we think data, once it flows to the consumer and is under their control and direction, it no longer sits under HIPAA. And so it becomes subject to, if you will, the Wild West of anything that goes under our more general, less prescriptive style of consumer privacy than exists in the GDPR. So we are really living under very different regulatory regimes as we try to navigate and enable consumer participation and consumer transparency and accountability for where that data goes. One thing I'd like to just recenter on for a moment before I turn it over to David is why this matters for you. I know our goal is to get to faster cures. Let's figure out how we can be more innovative, develop more clinical trials, recruit more representative populations to participate in clinical trials. And all of those functions should be made more accessible through greater interoperability and greater permissions. But we are also at an inflection point where there is no priority still, even in that trusted exchange framework and common agreement, for data to flow for permitted, for clinical research purposes. We are still prioritized on treatment. The other permitted uses under HIPAA, like government benefits determination and public health and patient right of access, those have distinct priorities over the secondary uses, including clinical research. And so that doesn't mean it's not moving forward. It actually means business, because that's what we do in the United States. Business finds solutions. And the solutions that we're seeing now are really existing in the private networks that are established by EMR vendors. And they're the ones that are building new products to support the clinical research community. But before you think that's the only way to go, I do want to go back to the idea that consumers can and do have an interest in treatments when they're incentivized to find them. And so there are opportunities under that right of access and through existing interoperability infrastructure to help consumers participate in their own health journey. And as part of that, to even provide value propositions to them based on their own data and based on clinical analysis for them in consumer applications, to surface potential clinical trials that may be relevant to them and that allow you to get to the top of the funnel so that you can actually get to more of a broad representation of potential participants in your trials. And I can talk more about that as we keep going in this conversation.
Thank you. David.
Hello, everyone. I'm David Peliquin. I'm a partner at Ropes & Gray here in Boston and focus my practice on advising on, among other things, clinical research issues and data privacy, and have the good fortune of working with a lot of your companies and institutions here today. My exposure to health information exchanges started before I became a lawyer. About 20 years ago, I worked at a company called Epic, which I think many of you are familiar with, which is now maybe the nation's, maybe the world's largest electronic health record provider. And at the time I was about to leave Epic, they would have these big staff meetings every month where the whole company would get together and hear what was new. They were introducing this idea of something called Care Everywhere. And Care Everywhere was an idea of exchanging patients' data between different hospitals. It started in the US at the time, that used the Epic electronic health record to allow a patient that was maybe a patient at Mass General Brigham, that was traveling and maybe they were on vacation in Florida, their provider that they saw in Florida could pull the record from their provider at Mass General Brigham to treat them. And this was really something new at the time and was one of these more private networks like Jill and Irene were alluding to. So fast forward to my life about 10 years later, when I'm a research attorney here at Ropes and Gray, I start getting questions about care everywhere from some of my hospital clients that are doing research. And they're thinking about, wouldn't this be cool if we could use care everywhere to pull records about patients for research purposes? But when you use care everywhere as an institution that uses EPIC, you have to agree to something EPIC calls rules of the road. You know, they never call things terms of use or like boring names in EPIC. There's always some more flashy name with it. So the rules of the road for EPIC, one of the things it said is you can only use the data that are pulled from care everywhere for treatment purposes. And a lot of my clients took a step back and said, well, that's interesting, because from a HIPAA standpoint, as we've heard, HIPAA permits disclosure of PHI, protected health information, for treatment without a patient's consent or authorization, so that made sense. But these clients were saying, you know, if we get a patient authorization, or if we have an institutional review board that waives the authorization requirement, HIPAA would say we should be able to get those records. But the rules of the road that EPIC put out there said, no, we're not giving records for research purposes, even if it would be a permissible pathway for sharing under HIPAA. And so then these clients started to think, well, what might we be able to? Maybe if we pull records for treatment initially, then a secondary use of those might be for research, as long as we have the correct HIPAA permissions. And you know, some people got comfortable that might be a way that we could do things. Another thought people had is, well, what if it's an interventional clinical trial? It's like in oncology, and the trial really is the patient's treatment. Maybe we would make the argument we need the records for treatment in the trial, or if it's an adverse event and the patient went to, let's say, an emergency room at a community hospital, then they come back to our academic medical center for their next visit. We need to follow up on that. Maybe we can pull the records for treatment there. Well, the bottom line is here, there were a lot of workarounds that one had to come up with for some type of use of the data for research purposes. And I give that example just to show that a lot of times I think researchers and institutions get very excited about the promise of HIEs, but then when you start to get into the details, the research uses have not been front and center to date. And so there have been some more obstacles in pulling those data. More recently, we have these exchanges, entities like Care Quality and Interoperability Framework that allows different HIEs and interoperable frameworks to participate in that allow the sharing of data. And I've had a lot of clients in clinical trial recruitment in recent months that have been very excited about some of these frameworks. Oh, could we get data from HIEs to potentially screen against inclusion and exclusion criteria for our trials to identify patients? And maybe we would get patient consent to do that. And then when those clients have moved forward and gotten into some of the details, you know, they've started to see what Jill and Irene have emphasized, that, well, these were really set up for treatment purposes. And when you read the terms and conditions, it's all about you're a treating provider of the patient and you're obtaining the information for a treatment purpose. And the challenge there is when you're doing research recruitment and maybe you're a vendor hired by the sponsor, you're not really in that treatment relationship. And so I've had to have a lot of conversations with clients recently about, you know, this framework doesn't really fit you right now. And what we've heard from some of the entities participating in these interoperability frameworks is, well, maybe next year we will have more exercise of the patient right of access. That's our next priority in some of these frameworks. And then you might be able to use the patient's consent to require or permit the disclosure of information for research recruitment purposes. The last thing I want to note, we were talking about the 21st Century Cures Act here a bit, and one piece of that law that's come up for me a lot in research recruitment and other spaces is what's called the information blocking rule, which some of you might be familiar with, which essentially says if an entity like a healthcare provider that's an actor under the rule has electronic health information, they can't block the sharing of that information if there's no legal impediment in the way of them sharing it. And this has been helpful, I think, for a lot of direct-to-consumer research studies like the NIH All of Us study or some of the private studies that have a similar model, because it means if a patient signs a broad authorization for sharing of their data, the healthcare provider that is asked to disclose data in response to that authorization generally needs to do so. And then that begs the question of, well, how does that work with the terms of the HIEs that are saying this is only for treatment? And I think that's kind of the next level of conversation we're going to get to in the research world. But that's what I see as a research attorney advising clients, a lot of incremental progress, but still a lot of challenges to be solved here.
Do you want to mention for a second Cosmos and you know,
Yeah.
sort of how that's evolving?
So the EHR providers continue to have different means of sharing data, and so Epic has a new model I think some of you may be familiar with called Cosmos that allows for the sharing of limited data sets, the data from which most identifiers have been shed, across different entities that use Epic for research purposes. And they also are making this Cosmos module available to sponsors of clinical trials like pharmaceutical manufacturers to identify which hospitals in the US might be good clinical trial sites for them. So some of the challenges I think that come up there are just making sure that if you're interested in using this product or any other product from other EHR vendors, that you really understand like what type of data are we getting? Is it a limited data set, or how do we link across the different populations in different health centers? There was a discussion of tokenization earlier. That's a key part of this. Like, are the data tokenized? If they are they still considered identifiable from a HIPAA standpoint? That's something really to think about. And then when we get into specialty types of data, like genomic data, how can those be shared because of the higher risks of re-identification?
And how much it costs.
Yes.
Because I think one of the things that we do really well in the United States is that we figure out how to productize things. And whereas the European Union is trying to come up with a bottoms-up approach to establishing and maintaining and preserving public trust, what we have is the data resides in some concentrated fashion by a number of different actors, including Epic as an example. It has like records on 3/4 of the US population. Maybe not the comprehensive set, but at least 3/4 of us are represented in an Epic record. And with that comes an enormous amount of power, and each of the Epic community members, customers, don't necessarily have a say in how that information is now, that they created. Let's remember who creates this data. It's our content creators at the bedside, right? And they're not getting compensated for these use cases. The Care Everywhere treatment use case or restriction is also available so that a new product can be established with a new monetization. And I think we just have to be cognizant that these are the dynamics that are at play as you try to figure out how to access your data and solve, develop your clinical trial and be successful in it, because there are a lot of dollars that then, are demanded. And it also helps explain, cynically, I'll just be cynical for a minute, that's what I'll do, is we have a lot of lip service paid to empowering consumers and patients in their own data, prioritizing that as a use case because it is an affirmative right under HIPAA, and yet there are persistently a number of policy or technical roadblocks that are presented to discourage the meaningful scalability of interoperability under the patient right of access. The means are there, and they're available, and an example of a technical challenge is we don't have a universal patient identifier in the United States. And so you have fat fingering and you have problems with demographics, and it can look like it's a very complicated problem to solve for matching. I will simply say today, Epic has solved patient matching across its community network, because inside my chart, I can go in and I can select the Link My Accounts feature, and with no more than a check the box, I will be surfaced a number of different other Epic community members that may hold my data. They can't do that without breaching, creating an unauthorized disclosure unless they've got a very high level of confidence that they've got the patient matching problem solved. Turn that around, Epic is a leading network on TEFCA, and it says patient matching is not safe enough for us to run the risk at scale for a mass number of unauthorized disclosures and breaches. If they can do it inside their own network, they can do it for others. And that's my issue with wanting to make sure that we can actually facilitate consumer-directed access. Because if you can activate consumers who are motivated to find treatments and also bring them other value around a longitudinal health record that is not tethered to one portal or one EMR vendor's portal product, then you're able to start thinking about decentralized clinical trials at scale by engaging your patients through a variety of different other applications. I hope that's not too
No, that was very
abstract.
clear.
Okay.
And I think very helpful. A challenge, though, to activate the patient network rather than just, legislating from Epic what's going to happen, right? So I'm interested in the consent issue for a second. And Irene, do people in the HIE consent for every disclosure, or they just consent once to have their data disclosed?
Well, they consent, there's the consent model changed over time to have 2 levels of consent, level 1 and level 2. It used to just be level 1. So level 1 is treatment. And when you consent in that model, originally you consented to have the provider, like I talked about, who you're in front of at that moment, be able to access everything about you that is in your region and now the shiny, right? So it's consenting to that provider having access to everything. And the example that was always given was, do I want my podiatrist to have everything about me? No. So when I'm in front of the podiatrist, I won't necessarily consent, but when I'm in for, sort of a general surgery, I will. Right? So that was that. But now there's level 2 consents, which is where research consent would come into play for a research project that needs consent. And so just like anything else, assuming your regional qualified entity or hub would allow it, and that the other hubs that have data also allow it. Right now, that's the way it works. There's a joint committee across the shiny that approves this research, and then the consent for those that don't opt out of it in terms of having their data available for it, then same thing can happen. You get the consent, and then you can pull all the data that happens to be available subject to all that I just said, and you pull it for the study. And that's sort of how it works, but it's only for that one study. And then there isn't consent. So generally, there's a sharing in the shiny is subject to affirmative consent, except when it's de-identified data, which has those other parameters that I talked about, or a limited data set. And there's certain ways that can be shared without consent. I hope that wasn't too confusing.
No, not at all.
And the consent in New York clashes with the national models that we just talked about. So it leaves providers who are the ones that contribute the data regionally, and then they can take part in the shiny in 2 different places. We have data sharing through the shiny, which we just talked about. And then, as a hospital attorney, right, I'm posed with, can we participate in the national projects? And right now, the shiny can't, because the model that I just talked about for so long that I thought was so brilliant, that I was really involved in, doesn't work because it's the opposite, because the national networks use the different model, whereas a patient, the providers say that they have consent for you to share your data with anyone, and then you're just done with it, not for research, right? But for treatment purposes. So New York, the shiny can't participate currently in the national networks. We could get data from it, but we can't give the data because in New York we have special rules about HIV and whatnot, and the policies that I just talked about prohibit that. It's just a different model, and it's not relying only on HIPAA, so it's clashing, and I think that will be another one of the things that is addressed probably pretty soon, because now that it's 20 years later and there is national sharing, and stuff like Epic happening, how can we not be part of that? So I think that will shift over time.
Did you want to comment, Jill?
Well, I was just thinking the only way you make a network work is by having reciprocity. Otherwise, we have a commons problem. And so it's a real challenge when you have a huge populace in New York not able to participate because you don't have the ability to reciprocate. And therefore, you're not in compliance with the network rules.
And we got kicked out.
And you got kicked out,
Yep.
right.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting because in almost every hospital consent and treatment consent, there is a line. What, 2 minutes? That is so not happening. When you sign a hospital consent or a treatment consent, you know, somewhere on page 7 of 19, there is a line that said your data and biospecimens can be used for education and research. And people call that consent. I call that notification, but it is a consent. And therefore, everybody, for the most part, has already consented, in quotes. Now, I don't believe it, but that is what hospitals rely on to use the data and the biospecimens that come out of that.
Well, right. So, but the patient signs that for your hospital.
No, I understand.
Right? And
I
so
understand.
now with the network of networks, the original rule had each regional network kind of deciding with its own policy committee whether they would allow that, whether they would allow entities to opt out because they didn't feel comfortable with that, participants, right? Each hospital would have a say. Now it's shifting to be a little bit more mandatory for the de-identified data and limited data set, so shifting.
And can a patient withdraw their data?
No.
Right.
The patient, because like I said before, at least in New York, the data is in there. It's
Yeah.
uploaded as a business associate. And so what they can do is not give consent and withdraw consent and not allow consent for where affirmative consent is required. But for what's called break the glass
Right.
uses where there's an emergency, that entity is allowed to get your data whether you consent or not.
Yeah.
It's an emergency, and then for certain public health uses and so forth.
And true nationally also? Can they withdraw?
Consent's not relevant.
Yeah, yeah. So, but even if consent's not relevant, they can't withdraw their data, right?
I don't think so.
The problem is that, sorry, with our trust framework, we haven't got it right yet, because there is not enough transparency under HIPAA to understand where data is flowing. That was done by design, the way HIPAA was designed. It was written in 1996.
Yeah.
And then, so there's no obligation to maintain a record of disclosures for legitimate treatment, payment, and healthcare operations. That's true in the networks too. And so what you actually have, if you do things other than classical treatment, is you are creating a lot of dark data flows. And those dark data flows are happening now because people do pull for legitimate treatment purposes, and then for all the other downstream uses that are otherwise permitted with that data, they're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually going to erode trust as more of the populace learns about it.
And given the last 2 weeks, I need to ask, can the government get into this data and use it for what uses it wishes under declared health requirements? And if you think the Supreme Court will resolve that, I just want to know what you're smoking.
Well, I mean, I actually have a different, who knows? I mean,
Yeah.
the interesting thing was that the first Trump administration took a very dim view to national networks or to the existing infrastructure for network-based exchange. Whether or not that similar dismissive nature will regain, you know, who knows? Who knows? But the Biden administration had been pushing it very hard, and I just don't know if the Trump administration will.
And a state such as Texas or Florida, can they get into it and decide they need to know certain information about their participants, their patients?
So the issue is that networks, not with the exception of New York, which is a centralized model, many are federated. And so whatever risks exist, whoever holds the data today, be it Children's Texas Hospital, they're at risk today, right? And there was a HIPAA rule to protect providers and patients. Who knows if that will persist? I mean, they're risks.
Yeah. So we didn't have time for questions. Is there anything burning that, knowing that you're drifting into lunch, I think? Oh, we have another session. We have to wrap. Any final thoughts from you all? Thank you so much. This was great.
Shall we get started? Yeah. Okay, wonderful. We're getting into the nudies, and we're hoping to have a very interactive discussion. Open with just a. Is this not working? Okay, a little bit. Okay, there we go. All right. We've all heard so much about AI, and often we hear about AI with the risks, hallucinations, privacy, all that sort of stuff. Absolutely, we are attentive to risks. Vivli has an AI risk framework that will be shared soon. But on this panel, I'd like to be more visionary, actually, and focus on opportunities for AI, particularly around clinical trials, data sharing, and data reuse. And we're going to be cover AI quite broadly, calling out 2 different kinds of AI for us to keep in mind as we have our panel discussion. One is predictive AI, so that the sort of machine learning, what is your risk for readmission kind of AI that you all know. We're going to call that analytic AI. And then, of course, the hot topic of the last, year or two, generative AI like ChatGPT, which I would like to suggest that we think about generative AI as a social technology and what that does for how we work and how we interact with each other across people that we may not have interacted with as much, and what does AI do to facilitate different workflows in different communities. So keep that in mind, the analytic and sort of social technology aspects of AI. So today, we're going to talk about what our panelists are working on today and what they might expect over the next 5 years. We know that this is a new field, and there may be terms that are confusing, and if so, I will ask the panelists to just note and define terms that might be confusing to our audience or indeed to ourselves. So I think we will start off, and I'll ask each panelist to introduce yourself and where you're coming from on AI and data sharing and reuse in your current role. Basically, sort of where you're coming from and what are you bringing to this panel, and then I think we'll go from there, and I think it'll be an open discussion. So might as well start with David to my right.
Yeah, so thank you, Ida. Happy to be on this panel. My perspective on AI is coming as a regulatory lawyer, and so I am advising clients that include hospitals, universities, pharmaceutical and medical device companies on their use of AI technologies. And so that includes use in clinical trials for various purposes. It includes using data within a hospital, let's say, to train AI models that are used in that hospital or that might be developed as a medical device under the FDA software as a medical device framework and then shared with other entities. When it comes to data sharing in particular, often what I'm helping clients think about is how does the use of data, large data sets to train an AI model, how does that fit within existing paradigms that we have in the US and elsewhere about health data privacy, for example? And so from the last panel, we spent a lot of time talking about under the HIE framework, what are the permissions in the US for data to be shared for different purposes between healthcare entities? Well, the same rules that apply in the HIE construct, we're thinking about HIPAA, we're thinking about state privacy laws, those all become very relevant when you're using health data and you want to either share it or use it internally at your organization to train an AI model. And so oftentimes we're thinking about, is this a research activity? Are we creating generalizable knowledge? Maybe, if we're developing a new device. And is that done under a research paradigm where we might have IRB oversight? We might need to seek patient authorization or IRB waiver of authorization for the use of a patient's health information. Or is this something we're trying to think of as a quality improvement activity? Are we using this AI tool really to improve the quality of care at our healthcare institution? But we're going to argue it's not creating generalizable knowledge. It's not something that is done under a research paradigm. And that distinction is important for a lot of my clients. And the last thing I'll say just as intro is a lot of my time is also spent on thinking about when a healthcare institution, for example, engages a third party to help them develop an AI technology. What rights does that third party have in the underlying data? Are they incorporated into the model itself so that they become an inherent part of it? Are they just used for the training and then they can be discarded? Even if they're just used for the training, can that vendor, can that third party, can they retain those data afterwards and use them to continue to refine and improve the model? And can they do that regardless of whether the improved model is used by the healthcare institution that was originally their customer? Those are all the types of questions that come up with every day with respect to AI in my practice and that I'm grappling with. So happy to discuss more in the Q&A and discussion period.
Wonderful. Lots of open questions there. Dawei.
Dawei Lin. I'm the Associate Director for Bioinformatics at the Division of Allergy, Immunology, and Transplantation. It is a division, extramural division of National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, NIH. So there's a long set of words. I guess I'm probably provide some the program officer perspective of AI and research, but the opinion is my own. I'm not representing NIH or NIAID. And so my perspective is I am a computational biology by training. I think there's a lot of things about AI. Probably we need like AI to help define what the AI is. But I think what I want to maybe focus on today is about the data quality and the long-term preservation and sustainability of data. So I started my career at the Protein Data Bank. Is a repository have a collection of protein structures, and some of you may heard of the name. Like the last month, the Nobel Prize was won by the AlphaFold that predict protein structure. They're using the PDB data. So that's kind of the quality that needed for enable research. But on the other hand, it took 50 years to realize that value. And now in my portfolio, we found another repository called the Import. It's an immunology repository. It's existing for 20 years. And we hope will not take another 30 years to have another Nobel Prize winning. And Import is a part of Vivli members. But I think on the other hand, we kind of learned a lot from the repository operations that is different from just like the scientific research. It has its own set of operations. So I led a global group, develop a trust principles. I heard the trust mentioned a lot. I think this is a set of trust principles for digital repository. It's more like transparency, responsibility, user focus, and sustainability and technology. So that's kind of the things we coming from. And I also personally involved with the across NIH effort and help in a working group develop and write the notice of award for multi-module AI for scientific research. And also I'm kind of involved the Bridge to AI, which is a common program to generate data, not models for AI. And I kind of participate as a project scientist and also kind of help develop the first round of funding opportunities for repository and knowledge base. And that's kind of the things that we're doing. So that's for me.
Carla.
Hi, I'm Carla Childers from Johnson & Johnson. I'm the head of bioethics-based science and technology policy, and in that capacity, I provide bioethics consultative services, chairing our internal committee and providing just routine advice. I also have a policy oversight component where we own various ethics-based research policies and provide the oversight, and then also have a thought leadership and education component. Within, regarding artificial intelligence, on the bioethics side, I serve as a subject matter expert for the application within ethics-based types approaches and product development. So very early on, I was clear to the organization that I wasn't going to be their AI ethics person that could solve supply chain, HR, finance, and all of those issues. So we've taken an approach internally that I serve then as a subject matter expert for ethics-based research questions and artificial intelligence on the various governance structures within Johnson & Johnson, much like probably other companies have different panels and different ways of providing. So a lot of that does come up with regards to use of data, but then it's also just the ethical application within clinical trials. With regards to data sharing, particularly, one of my roles is that since I joined J&J 11 years ago, I've overseen our collaboration with the Yale University Open Data Access, or YODA for all of you Star Wars fans, YODA project. That was our data sharing platform that we put in place and have managed that relationship and overseen the policy. So we've been thinking a lot and seeing an uptick in requests that have been coming in for programs for research projects that are in the artificial intelligence machine learning realm. I'm super interested in terms of that to think about forward-looking impacts on the platform. What kind of policies do we need to think about putting in place? Do we need to take a different approach about how we think about some of the review of those research projects, but very much involved in partnering with our operations team to figure out how we can support all the researchers wanting to do artificial intelligence types projects with our data.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Subha Madhavan. I work in Pfizer R&D. I have the great fortune of leading a global team called AI/ML, Quantitative and Digital Sciences, within our research and development organization. We do three simple things. The first one we call as clinical AI/ML, and the goal here is to leverage multimodal data, such as from clinical trials, real-world evidence data, biomarker data, and others, and use that model and the data sets to inform next generation of treatments. So we impact our entire portfolio by leveraging these multimodal data sets. There's a lot of analytic AI in the clinical AI space, just to kind of reference back to IDA's definition of predictive models and analytic AI. The second function is what we call as operational AI, and here this is all about generative AI, where we are deploying large language models to really optimize our processes in clinical development. As you can imagine, drug development is a very elaborate and very intricate process, and there are lots of documents and collaterals that are produced at every step of the way. The question we are asking is, could we leverage large language models to really make these processes more efficient? And the third component is what we call as digital AI, and this is all about wearables data. How many of you wearing Fitbit or an Apple Watch here? I see some hands up. We think very hard about the types of data that are coming out of these Apple Watches and Fitbits, particularly in the context of what the earlier panel, the gentleman from Epic mentioned, a care anywhere model. So could we collect data that can tell us about efficacy and safety in the comfort of their homes, and what data can we collect? And regulators are very receptive to this. We're starting to think about digital endpoints in therapy areas such as Duchenne muscular dystrophy, rare diseases, cancer, cachexia, and others, where we don't have to bring participants to clinical sites every so often to collect data. Could we actually use these devices to collect data from the comfort of their homes? So those are sort of three primary functions. With regard to these three functions, we interact quite a bit with regulators, right? So to understand what is the AI code of ethics, what does fit for purpose AI really mean? What does it mean to actually submit an analysis plan that describes a machine learning model to our regulators? How should we be thinking about the data and the models? Is it representative enough of the population that we want to serve? Not just the population we want to recruit in the clinical trials, but also the population that we want to serve post-launch of these drugs. We think a lot about compliance frameworks and guardrails. So the perspective that I have is one of optimism. I think AI has a lot to bring to the table, but we also need to take a balanced viewpoint of one that is stems from trust but verification framework. Yes, we trust the colleagues that we work with, but we want to have a very systematic risk-based framework that we can leverage to think about how we deploy responsible and also fit-for-purpose AI. So really excited to be on this panel. Thank you, Vivli, for putting this together. Over back to you, Ida.
Great. So you can see the variety of perspectives. Tying our discussion back perhaps to the previous two panels where we've talked about the European health data space and health information exchange, where we're pulling data together that's been primarily for care coordination, but the opportunities for research are so high. There's a term that goes around AI ready. And what does that mean if we're casting ourselves 5 years ahead and we've got EHDS working and National Health IE working? And what does it mean for that data to be AI ready, and what would that get us? Anyone want to take that one on?
Yeah, maybe I can start with that because I just came back from our Research Data Alliance, and if you go to every room, that will talk about AI-ready data set. And of course, there is a lot of definitions, but mainly I think people refer to data quality. Is it quality enough that you can train AI models? And then something about also the documentation, that can people understand enough your data to use it? And also the access. I think we talk a lot about the legal issues, the ethical issues, that are you allowed to use those data that for your purpose? And I should mention there is two things that we kind of look at it. One is that there is the Earth Science AI-ready checklist. That's kind of what the import actually is used to build the AI-ready data set. And there's another just published as a bioarchive. If you search probably Bridge AI standards. I forgot exactly the name, but that there is also a framework that what AI-ready means for biomedical data.
Go ahead.
And maybe I can offer from the perspective wearing the hat of thinking from a YODA project as we expect to be ready for increased project requests coming in. We're thinking about what type of infrastructure does our current platform where we host the data in that secure environment, does it have enough computing power? Does it have enough just technical ability to support the projects? We've been doing a pilot where we've almost had to alternate researchers so that they don't bog down the system and use up all the capacity. So really trying to understand that from an infrastructure perspective. But then also on the policy and ethics side, the data use agreements, any of the permissions, just kind of pressure testing. We're starting off with the assumption that this shouldn't break the system or shouldn't really, we have those processes built in, but are there certain terms in our informed consent? So we're just doing a little bit of a thought exercise as we think about secondary use of, are we trying to at least address some of those potential roadblocks? I really like the comment, I think it might have been David Leventhal also, how do we better characterize the data that we do have so people can understand the characteristics? Can you use synthetic data to describe what your data set actually looks like? So really trying to think about the transparency of what is available so it can be maximized and that it feeds into that understanding of, if you're going to apply artificial intelligence to it, knowing what the key features of the data set. So those are just a few things we're sort of thinking about now in the context of data sharing.
I think one thing I'd add is, the tremendous opportunity that we have now that we probably didn't have, about a decade ago, are all of these data sets that we're collecting, right? So, at home, video data, imaging data, biomarker data, clinical care data, et cetera. In terms of making these data sets AI ready, the harmonization and labeling of data sets is quite important, right? So we talk a lot about AI these days, but really what actually gets us to there, and I think Daibe was mentioning the Bridge to AI project, is really having that enormous focus on data. I'm seeing a lot of that, not just within our organization, but also, peer pharma, and also others, and especially enabled by organizations and platforms like Vivli, is how do we standardize cross-study data set so that we could, in fact, do that cross-study analysis, right? Because each study, you collect the data in a certain form. You've got the case report forms, you've got the patient-reported data. But then if I now want to compare with a similar mechanism of action with another study, we're not able to do that because there's not that harmonization that's possible. So I think in order to be really AI ready, we need to kind of think about, how do we enable these cross-study comparisons. I think just in terms of enormity of data, we think a lot about, for example, the genomics data. If I think I read recently somewhere that the amount of genomic data that we collect in 1 year, if you actually put them in 1.6 millimeter CD-ROMs, well, first of all, when I say that to my son, he'll say, what's a CD-ROM? Once we get past the definition of a CD-ROM, you actually put this data, you can stack the CD-ROMs from Earth to the moon and a quarter of a way back, right? This is just 1 year's worth of genomic data that we're collecting. And so we think a lot about how do we make that fit for purpose? How do we constrain the data to really give us the answers that we're looking for? So, there's a lot of obesity research that's going on now, right? So, GLP-1s, are there potential combinations of these drugs? What are the mechanisms of action? From all of this array of genomic data, could we actually constrain and get down to that biological pathway? It's actually not easy to do, right? And AI can help us, but then we need to label and harmonize this data and make it fit for purpose before we can feed them into these models. So AI readiness is a good way to kind of, think about how we go from this enormous amount of information to something that can help me answer the questions that I have in front of me.
One other thing I'd like to throw out is just speaking as an attorney on these issues, is also thinking about the issue of bias. Like, do we have a data set that's representative for the population on which it will be used? And this is something we've seen even in the US, like state attorney generals be very interested in recently and sending letters to hospitals asking about AI tools that they're using at the hospital, and has this been trained in a way that is going to work on the population you serve and won't have bias and not work in certain populations. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind.
So maybe I can add another point. I think because the Shubha kind of mentioned about standard kind of triggered my thought. So we just organized a workshop on AI and immunology like in May this year, and the report is published in Nature Immunology. And one of the discussion about the AI ready is that is not a static thing. It's kind of moving along, and the clinicians in the room. And in the end, they all regret that the clinical notes they write before they're using the codings. And they said if they know the large language model exists, probably they would just record all the conversations with the patient, and then has much richer information that they can use for the clinical trial study or treatment. So I think that's the aspect is that it's kind of, when you say ready, it's probably like have to define like at what stage you are at, and then you may have different take on it.
Yeah, that actually, it's a really interesting point. I've just started using AI Scribe in my clinical care. So now I can just talk to my patients without having to type my notes at the same time. And many of my patients are Chinese, so I speak to them in Chinese and I write my notes in English, and it's kind of a mess. But now I don't have to do that. I just talk.
Yeah.
And the AI generates a note. But you know what? That note that's generated is highly abstracted. All the nuance about where they went for traveling, how their son is doing, or their housing, it's just like blood pressure, AM blood pressure, whatever. So, yeah, it's interesting. The source data itself is going to start to be affected by how AI is used in our work life, in our workflow, and maybe some comments on that. And this reflects in the previous two conversations too, right? We kind of have assumed when the data comes out the way that we've always had it come up, but that is just not true anymore.
Well, and I was going to ask Ida, that's really interesting. So do you find yourself having to, let's say your patient told you something really important personally that didn't get captured. Do you find yourself spending time going in to add that, or do you just not even have time and you're like, well, I don't have time to go back and that's what I'm always interested in, is the human in the loop review of what that was. Does it increase the time you now have to take, or do you just not even have the time and can't go back and maybe change or augment?
So the system that I'm using is Ambiance, and I don't have any financial dealings with any of these companies, but it generates the note in different sections. Mm-hmm. So like there's the chief complaint, the HPI, and then the after visit summary for those of you who are on Epic. I look at the HPI and I scan it and I do add in the colored commentary that I want. Mm-hmm. But that's very selective. That's very selective.
And dependent on how much time you have then,
and
remembering.
And how much I know of them and what the purpose is. So you see there's a lot, and you can imagine how bias comes in now, right? In which of your patients you're interviewing. I don't use the assessment and plan. I do that myself. Mm-hmm. But the majority of our clinicians at UCSF are using the AI-generated assessment and plan. So there's a lot of introduction of a factor that I think we haven't had much experience before that we should.
Yeah, I think to build on that, and also Naive was talking about quality, which is so central to AI readiness, and how this data are now collected. You're talking to AI, you're talking to AI tools, it's capturing data. We're using co-pilots to summarize information. We actually ran a challenge last year, not so much in the context of provider interaction, but more in the context of regulatory documents that come out of clinical trials, right? We call them CSRs, clinical study reports. These are 100-page documents. Every study we generate a clinical study report, and there are hundreds and hundreds of them every year. So the question that the team was asking was, could AI create the agency for medical writers by putting first drafts in front of them to allow for just the interpretation piece? So if all the sections, because these are standard templates, if you slot in all the text for first draft, then could people just go in and add their color commentary or this? And we had 21 different partners participate. This is public information. You can kind of look up. I think this was published in JAMIA, and you can find it. What we found was, and this was pre-GPT 4.0 days, so it's 3.0 series, we found that the factual accuracy was less than 80%, right? But even so, 80% is pretty good for a first draft, right? And then the medical writers could go in and talk about these sections. What we also learned, we're talking generative AI, not the analytic AI, right? So it's very bad at arithmetic, for example, right? So you start to think about what are those areas where we really need that human in the loop. So it would make some really silly mistakes if there were 22 patients and 11 patients on each arm, placebo and the treated arm. It would start to summarize for all 22 instead of talking just about the 11 that were on the treated arm and things like that. So the next iteration of that challenge was, okay, now I can highlight in blue all the arithmetic sections and the interpretation sections that I do want the human input on, right? And so I think it's not just the machines iteratively learning, but it's also the humans learning how I can use these systems better, and what are those areas where AI may not be perfect, but I think the combination of AI and human can really elevate the quality of the data that we collect.
I like the example of you saying, what tools can we use to help highlight for the humans where we want them to focus? Because one of my big concerns that we've been talking a lot about informed consent forms, and trying to make this positive, is as we do that, can you actually focus them on the places, like take care of the stuff that they'll still need to review, but then really highlight and say this is where you need to spend your time. So that's super interesting.
Yeah,
I haven't heard of that one.
And it's super helpful for people because now they don't have to look through the 100-page document.
Right, the 100-page, they can go to the sections.
Exactly.
Interesting.
Has anybody been using generative AI to make clinical trials sort of more accessible and understandable to participants and patients who might want to join the trial?
I have a project that I'm working on with a few people right now to understand more of we've been talking about, is it appropriate, in what context might it be appropriate to use like a chat bot to help explain factual things, which I think a lot of us have talked about, and helping, again, draw those lines, like Shubha said, of where do you not want, like if it's the individual's medical experience and you're starting to get into interpretation, how do you have appropriate off-ramps to get that person to a human, but can you use it? And because right now the electronic informed consent is basically like DocuSign. We throw a 40-page PDF in there and it's not helpful at all. So can you make it more engaging by using some of these tools, including chatbots or assistants or avatars to help but yet, again, where do you find the appropriate off-ramp? So definitely some opportunities in informed consent that we're working on and trying to figure out if we can put together a project that shows where you can showcase what good looks like to try to spur industry to get over that hump that we've been seeing of really incorporating it effectively.
I think just to add another example to what Carla is just talking about, the World Health Organization recently launched a chatbot called Sarah, and this, you can actually talk to Sarah. I mean, she's not perfect. She's a digital avatar, but she'll talk to you about. I think they had launched it, if I remember correctly, in the non-communicable diseases space. It's intended to be an educational chatbot where you could actually talk to her. Of course, she's not perfect, but it depends on what information you use to train these chatbots, and that's something that the regulators are very much interested in, right? So how do you prevent sort of bias and hallucination? Now, can the chatbots talk about things outside of what the participant or the patient is asking? And so can you constrain that using the documents that are very specific and approved by your clinical team or your IRB to actually train these chatbots? So I think we're starting to see some of them come out. I could imagine, one of the projects that we worked on pre-Pfizer days was with the PALS organization, so the Pancreatic Cancer Advocacy Network, where patients with advanced metastatic cancers would call this advocacy group to get recommendations on clinical trials and whatnot. And it was extremely constrained by manpower that was available, the humans who can actually take these phone calls. And we could imagine a situation where there could be these chatbots, et cetera, that could potentially be deployed if they're trained on the appropriate pancreatic cancer trials.
Like a closed data source with the bounds on what they can and cannot interpret.
Yeah, exactly. And how transformational could that be? I think we're slowly starting to see some of those examples come out.
And I think one of the issues when I see clients that are using these technologies, like in the informed consent process or otherwise, is thinking about the oversight. What's the quality control to ensure that things are explained appropriately, and where is the human in the loop doing that oversight, especially if they're activities that when we think about from a regulatory standpoint, the investigator is supposed to have oversight over. How does he or she exercise that oversight when it's an AI activity or an AI technology that's providing that information to the clinical trial subject, for example?
Yeah, maybe I'll just add an example. Probably you can try it yourself. You're trying to explain like what import is, and using the ChatGPT is doing really well. And then I know you can ask, like say, can you explain import to a second grader?
Yeah.
And can you explain the import to a philosopher or maybe a politician? And they gave a really nice perspective. I think that's kind of the power that the generative AI can help facilitate the communications.
And it can now generate a podcast for you also. Right, that's the next step.
It'll be an AI panel next time.
Yeah, we could all just
a
generative panel. We can have a But I think it's time to open the floor up to questions. This is a new topic, so are there questions in the room, and are there questions on the Zoom? Oh, yeah, we'll start in the room.
Thanks very much, really interesting. What does the panel think that the role is in AI in relation to the kind of traditional statistical inference that's used for these trials? Because just now, even though they come from similar kind of mathematical traditions, they sit like these two rival magisteria. So what's going to happen in the future about statistics and AI?
I can start, and hopefully colleagues will join. My running joke is that if I can convince my statistics colleagues with the AI outputs, then I can convince anybody in the world, the President of the United States. Well, maybe not the current one. Anyway. Yeah, I think that's a very important question for us to consider. The way I like to think about it is, I think AI allows us to be discovering more data, right? So it's more discovery, it helps us expand, broaden our aperture to what other data can help me solve my problems. But at the end of the day, the confirmatory analysis have to be done through statistical analysis, right? And so I'll give you a classic example. So this is, our COVID programs. There was a question around who actually gets severe disease, right? Who gets severe disease of COVID, and does that have an impact on, who gets antiviral treatments, for example, right? And there are so many implications to this. So when this research started, we had a rough idea. Our clinical teams had an idea that, maybe it has something to do with age. Maybe it has something to do with blood pressure, right? So those 2 or 3 data points. But once you start integrating clinical trial data, perhaps healthcare utilization data from claims and EHR, it broadens your aperture to all of these potential possibilities, these features that could be associated with severe disease of COVID. I think AI does a very good job of that, expanding your feature space and also prioritizing those features. And then we had to take that to our statistics colleagues to say, what are those 7 or 8 features that are absolutely confirmatory that we then want to test in our next clinical trial, or to make that part of a care process where the clinician is saying, I need to check off these few data elements before I prescribe an antiviral, right? So I think it's not either or, it's both, and how and where we collaborate between AI and statistics. I think it's an emerging theme. Lots of great conferences to have this conversation. The Joint Statistical Conference every year. They have a whole section now around AI/ML and how to kind of bring together some of the statistical thinking and the AI/ML thinking together.
Yeah, maybe I want to add a little bit perspective, like very different from the traditional statistical thinking, is that the AI make the statistical analysis much accessible to people who not necessarily to be statisticians, and so in the sense you have to know R or SAS to know how to do the analysis, right? But OpenAI allow you to use just natural language, and to do the analysis, like to generate like a general linear model or something. Actually, we did this for an intern project. It took that intern like 3 months to do the analysis, and then we repeat that on the OpenAI, just use natural language, like in 2 hours. And the result is very comparable. So I think that's kind of another opportunity that maybe a lot of more people can do the analysis, right? That's kind of one aspect, but they also like say, if you really want a kind of rigorous result, now the people can use that the AI technology can really formalize a very good question, right? They couldn't ask that question before. So with that capability, I think we can see a lot more kind of collaboration, maybe the innovation from the new capabilities.
Question?
Yes, Oladayo from the HE Sankyo. At a session yesterday at the MRCT presentation, there was the talk about synthetic data and digital twins. Can you address that and the risk that process in actually giving trust in the type of data that you bring out?
Excellent question. Digital twin synthetic data.
So I'll just mention on synthetic data, we've been looking at it as an option to make data more accessible with less risks related to privacy. So can you use synthetic data in circumstances where you're wanting to create more open access because you have better privacy protection? We're also doing a pilot right now to almost do what Dawe was saying about doing an analysis with an actual data set, creating the synthetic data and comparing the results. So we're starting to just try to use it to, because some of these tools are pushing us to think about broader access outside of some of the secure environments, or even just increasing the amount of data available. And I still want to go, I love the idea though of using synthetic data even to characterize what the features of that data set are. I think that's really interesting, hadn't thought of that. So I guess we're not looking at synthetic data, I think you might have said as a risk, we're looking at it as really opening up some opportunities with discipline and rigor and analysis to create broader access to, and to create data that gets over some of the hurdles that we've had with sharing data from a security and privacy perspective.
Yeah, I think just to build on that, I mean, I'm quite bullish actually about the digital twin technology. So just to kind of describe that to folks who may not have heard, the concept of digital twins actually comes from the airline industry. So they wanted to create digital twins of these engine parts, et cetera, so that they don't actually have to test it in the production system, and they can actually test it in these digital twins, and it actually really made the processes very efficient. So the question is, can we actually map that back to life sciences and the healthcare situation? The one area where I'm quite bullish about digital twins is in control arms in clinical trials, right? Let's say a registrational clinical trial, you need about 400 patients, let's say, and 200 patients on the control arm, 200 patients on the treatment arm. Do we need to recruit those 200 patients in the control arm? We have studied breast cancer for so many years. We've studied atopic dermatitis for so many years. We've studied viral infections for so many years. And this ties in with sort of Vivli's and MCRT's mission of data sharing, right? So if there is enough data sharing, you could imagine a situation where you could accurately construct the 200 digital twins who can actually be part of that control arm, and then all you do is recruit patients, and that cuts your time frame to half, right? So instead of taking 10 years to actually develop a drug, now maybe we could be at 5 or 6 year time frame because you can recruit only half the number of patients. The EMA has been much more, receptive of the idea of digital twins. There have been some guidelines and some regulations that have come out. I think FDA and others are still thinking about it, but I do think that in the next 3 to 5 years, we're going to see more and more of that, especially in the context of all the data that are being collected, well-labeled data sets in diseases that we have studied for a very long time. There is a perfect use case here to construct the control arm patients using digital twins.
And one of the questions that's coming up in the bioethics community is, at what point do you have a tipping point where it's unethical to not that's probably strong, but like you have an ethical motivation. And to actually use that and expose fewer patients. So there's been I see Barbara rolling her eyes, so I will emphasize we're not there, and that's an interesting discussion, but it's percolating. I saw that.
So I need an ethicist with me all the time. When I make comments, I should travel in pairs. Yeah.
So it sounds like at some point Vivli will be collecting and sharing data sets of digital twin control arms. And so when you go to Vivli, you might be accessing synthetic data as part of this study data set. That would be quite interesting. And then just be careful if you pull those, because then you're pulling synthetic data with synthetic data.
Quite enabling. Yes.
So maybe you can add another perspective about concern of the synthetic data, right? Because you have used that because you don't have data. And we mentioned a lot about the small sample size. And actually for immunology disease, especially the autoimmune disease, you're never going to have a big cohort. The reason is the immunology response, you have to have comparable result with the same exposure history, and at a certain time you're taking the drug, different age. There was a lot of complications, so you will not have the cohort. But although the symptoms may be different, but the underlying mechanism can be the same. So maybe the kind of the foundation models can help you to really kind of mine the clinical nodes and to see if many of them are maybe share some common mechanism. So they can be like a new cohort that increase the size. So that's kind of maybe another way to think about increase the usable data.
Maybe let's take one question.
Ben Rhodes from Eli Lilly. I think the thing that I have a concern with thinking about control arms and digital twins is that's an assumption that the standard of care hasn't progressed from the point in time in which you created the data for those digital twins. And I think we're seeing clinical care continuing to progress even more rapidly than it has in the past. And in some situations, I mean, if you're talking about a placebo control, absolutely, you know, can consider that. But if you're truly doing standard of care versus the comparator, then you're going to have to really match standard of care, especially as there are these opportunities in the European health data space to say, does the patient group that was in the trial look like the patient group that exists today? Because they're not going to look the same if it's data from 10 years ago.
I think that's a good reminder for all applications of artificial intelligence and scientific rigor. And as we look, and this is what I say a lot internally at J&J, is like you can't just throw out the window all the things you knew about statistical analysis, ethical conduct of research, and all these things. It still is the rigor of what are you trying to compare and what are you trying to achieve, not just because you can do synthetic data. I think that's an important push, because the more people see it as a cost savings, well, we should just have the synthetic data for everything, because then we save money and it's faster. So I do think continuing to be important advocates for appropriate, rigorous science and research and ethical conduct of research is important.
Wonderful. Well, in keeping with our theme of focusing on opportunities, I'll ask each of the panelists in our closing minutes here to give what you think is the sort of the highest value use of AI that you might see in the near future. You take them.
So, I mean, as an attorney, and we haven't really talked about this, maybe it's a little bit different for this panel, but we definitely see a lot of opportunities in law firms and elsewhere to use it in our practice and to help with research tasks and understanding and putting together legal arguments even. And now when I see the Google results, whenever I Google something and I see the AI suggestion, I see a lot of mistakes there, but I see like, oh, it lets you trace back the sources, and if you use it in that way and do a lot of quality control, it may be helpful. So very different than I know what most of you work on, but in my personal life, that's how I see it coming into play.
Yeah, maybe I would add on to that. I think I'm also very optimistic about the generative AI, and I think that's the opportunity that take advantage of the knowledge what are already accumulated. For example, there is a foundation models really map out the central dogma, you know, the DNA models, the protein models, you know, and also the single cell models. And the research now can not necessarily from scratch, it's kind of from really the guidance for that. And plus the kind of together with the other innovations, you know, from different fields, like the engineering models and you know the material science models. I think we're going to see that people kind of generate new proteins. You know, they have the new maybe innovative clinical trials. So I think that's kind of the things we like to see probably get more and more happening.
So AI driving the process of research as well as the output. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Carmen.
Mine's a little similar to David, and I do love those. Like, I look at them with skepticism, but then I often find nuggets. I think that will be part of the challenge of data sharing we've seen in industry is just helping people understand what's available. And wouldn't it be great if this could be a way of really surfacing and characterizing what is available and making connections around here are all the data sets that have been shared through all the different platforms, and really seeing if that can make an impact and helping people understand what's available.
Yeah, I think two things, right, in terms of opportunities. One is definitely the productivity equation is positive. I think we all can vouch for that. I was sharing this with one of the colleagues here, that we have something called the Bravo Awards, where we appreciate colleagues at the end of the week for all the workshops and all the work and all the collaborations throughout that week. It used to take me literally the entire Friday afternoon to write these Bravo Awards. I do them exactly in 10 minutes now, or less, right? And to your point, how can we be better prompt engineers, right? So if you say, you know, write it like a clinical pharmacologist, write it like a statistician, write it like a data scientist, write this award statement like a statistician, I do it in less than 10 minutes. So I think it's creating an agency for, you know, higher level thinking, better work, so that, you know, some of this grunt work. So clearly that the productivity equation is positive. I think the better, bigger opportunity is, you know, nobody really trusts AI, but everybody wants to kind of gather around AI. So what we're starting to see is the ways of working are changing, right? Because especially in large organizations, there are too many silos, and everybody has their expertise, their data, et cetera, and their focus. But people will come around an AI dashboard to see what medical affairs is doing, what commercial is doing, what R&D is doing, right? And so if this is the way that we bring people together and we can actually trigger new thought processes and new insights, I think that's a great win for AI. And I think there is a huge opportunity there for us to bring people together and allow people to connect in ways that they have not done so before.
Wonderful. AI is a social technology. Well, let's take away here a sense of a bright future for AI for this Friday afternoon, and we're off for lunch. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. You know what, as I'm sitting here thinking, I just would love to, oh, thank you for the panel. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much. You know, as I'm thinking, and Barbara coming up, I'm just thinking I'd love to reprise all of these panels, including this one, having Steffen back, and HIE, and the panel in 3 years. What do you think, Barbara?
I think
3 years? 2 years? 4 years?
Like tomorrow.
I don't think we'll solve all the problems and, you know, all these, or have a forward thought in tomorrow, but maybe in a few years.
Yeah,
What
I
do you-
think so.
Yeah. Well, I just thought, you know, Barbara and I will close. I just had some, you know, closing thoughts, and we will leave you to lunch, but I saw some common themes across all the panels today, and I just wanted to leave you with some thoughts, and I know Barbara will also close us. So some things I saw across the panels that I was, you know, very hopeful is some things I noticed were, you know, there were a lot of commonalities across the panels, you know, how to share data while maintaining the public trust, common goals of, you know, towards faster cures and therapeutics, and how to get there were clearly, you know, governance and permissioning and the complexities of secondary use. There were concerns around, you know, consent and re-identification, especially with the advent of AI and interoperability and harmonization. These are not new issues, but there are ones that we really have not yet solved. And future and forward-looking, you know, there's a lot of promise around AI, and I thought this was really an interesting panel and offers great promise, of course, with the appropriate guardrails. So, Barbara, your thoughts?
Sure. You know, I think a couple of things. One, I was incredibly impressed with how far we've come in the use of data, the understanding of what we can do with data, the sort of responsibility that we have for that data and governance of that data. And that evolution has been unbelievably fast. And when we think of when this started, you know, Vivli started, you know, 10 years ago. MRCT is 15 years old. We were in a completely different space. And we're now talking about, you know, using the incredible depth of data for public health discovery and making the world better. That comes with it a huge responsibility as well, which I think we heard today. And I think the one thing that I would emphasize is how we need to really take education and transparency seriously, because we need the public to stay with us as we do this, because that's going to be the greatest risk, I think, for how we are criticized or celebrated for the work we do. And I leave that as a sort of grounding reminder of our work ahead.
So thank you so much for your participation today, and we welcome you to lunch and further conversation. Thanks.
That was so great. Today was great.